All right, let me switch everything over here and we'll get started. All right, hopefully my audio is coming through here. If anyone has issues with audio, just let me know in the chat and I'll see if I can fix it. But I did some tests earlier and everything should be okay. We'll start here in just a minute. Audio is good, fantastic. Pull everything up here. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. This is the first webinar I'll be hosting, remote viewing webinar, kind of going over projects that I've been a part of over the past, I don't even know now, 5 to 6 years with various remote viewing groups. And just talking about a lot of different things remote viewing related. So I figure kind of what this is tonight is a little bit of an experiment. I wanted to keep kind of the amount of people a little bit lower than the last webinar I did, just so that I could kind of have a back and forth at the end after go over the remote viewing work and some of the data. And if you guys have any feedback for me at the end, this audio and all this kind of stuff, that's obviously fantastic too. But the purpose of this is kind of to figure it out as I go along. And then also I'll be shifting over to doing YouTube videos as well. And so I think doing like a webinar, maybe once or twice a month to kind of engage with people that find the work interesting or interested in remote viewing. And then also doing like short 10 to 15 minute videos, I think on YouTube on various targets. And then like these webinars I'll kind of leave for deep dive going into kind of the specifics. So one of the things I'll be doing tonight is something that I've really never done before, which is go through actual remote viewing session data with a large group of people, usually for kind of showcasing remote viewing work. I get this question a lot sometimes from various people on social media and also just in private emails about, we want to see the actual session work. And usually it's like, it's the remote viewing aficionados that kind of want to see what it looks like. And I've always been a little hesitant, and I know a lot of other remote viewers out there are a little bit hesitant to kind of show what their work looks like as well, because it might be misunderstood. And so this is kind of a little bit of a test or an experiment to see if there's a way to kind of showcase what structured remote viewing looks like. And I'll get into some of the details if you're completely new to remote viewing tonight about what structured RV means and why it might be misunderstood. I'll kind of get into all those coming up tonight. But it's kind of a test to see if it works, and if it does work. There's no sound from Marilyn. Check if you press Marilyn, if you press in the bottom left-hand corner, I think you have to connect to audio. But otherwise on my end, it shows that it is picking up my audio and recording it. So maybe if you press that button to connect to audio in the bottom left-hand corner, that will solve your problem. If it doesn't, let me know though. So essentially it's kind of moving forward. This is a kind of an experiment. Going to go over some remote viewing data, remote viewing session work, and I'll be talking a little bit about how the process is actually done, and then the analysis is done, and then kind of where I'll be going tonight is I'm going to be focusing on 3 different projects. The first project, I guess I just realized Marilyn can't hear me, so she wouldn't have heard me tell her that to click the button in the bottom corner. Let me just tell her real quick. There you go. Focusing on a lot of different things. Okay, so I'll be talking about 3 different projects tonight. The first project I want to talk about, well, I'm going to start with a couple of remote viewing examples. So if you're completely new to remote viewing, and this is also because this video was going to go up on the website or on YouTube as well as a website. It's kind of the first introduction to this new series of videos I'm going to be doing on remote viewing. And I kind of want to set a baseline to understand what this is, because the term remote viewing means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, primarily because it's a very loose label that's kind of thrown around on the internet, on forums and different groups. And so I'm going to kind of specify what I'm referring to. And when I'm talking about remote viewing, it's typically structured remote viewing. But I'll get into that. That's where I'm going to kind of start. And I'm going to show a couple really basic examples of what's possible with structured remote viewing. And then after that, I'm going to get into the 3 projects that I want to talk about tonight. The first one being cryptocurrency. And this was a project I ran last June. And I put together a report with a couple other viewers that we released to a few people, but we never released really to a larger audience. And so if you saw my last video from the week before, all of the detail, and actually the report's going to be made available later this month. But I kind of wanted to go through the actual remote viewing data, the session work, to kind of show everyone what that looks like, as well as kind of what we saw, because what we looked at was long-term impacts of Bitcoin as well as Ethereum, kind of Bitcoin's smaller, not really a rival at this stage of the game, but it's probably the second most popular cryptocurrency that's out there right now. So we looked at the long-term impact of those, which simply means long-term impact essentially means looking forward in time 6+ months. And so it can be 6 months to up to 3 years. So it's over the next couple of years, essentially, is what long-term impact, just anecdotally we know, means with remote viewing. So that'll be the first project. I'll be going over that work, kind of showing what our results on that, what we see happening with it. And I'll talk a little bit about predictive remote viewing as well, just kind of get an understanding of, are we seeing into the future? Are we seeing into potential futures? What's the, how does that work? So I'll be talking a little bit about that after the RV examples. Second project I'm going to talk about is one that we got a lot of traction with. I actually ended up going on the Jimmy Church radio show, as well as the John B. Wells radio show, and which was the Nazca Mummy. And for the first time, I'd like to really show what the remote viewing data looked like, what the session work looked like, and kind of walk you guys through that to kind of see what we saw. That also is the kind of stuff that we sent. There's some kind of interesting things that happen in the background that I kind of want to talk about as well. As we were running the session work, as well as what kind of transpired after we reached out to Gaia, and then we reached out to a couple other sources, and we just had like a really large interest in the results based on, a number of things, which I'll get into. So that'll be the second project I want to go into tonight. And the final one I want to go into tonight is one that I've actually never discussed publicly, and yet it's the project, it's a remote viewing project that I've probably spent more time on than any other remote viewing project in my entire life. It's something that has over 2 years worth of remote viewing work by 6 different advanced remote viewers on, all of the work completely blind. And if you don't know what that means, I'll be explaining that in upcoming here in just a minute. And there's way too much work to kind of go into in one sitting. It's something that I'm going to start talking about probably over the next couple months, because it's something of kind of great import and interest to me, and I think a lot of other people would find it kind of interesting. But it's what this is associated with is a number of years ago, I put together a project to look for, and I was kind of naive at the time because I thought, I'll just find something small and it'll be simple and wrap up the project and I'll move on. And little did I know, end up 2 years of work kind of went into it. And then some, actually. But I decided to look at North America, the most significant presently undiscovered artifact. And I figured maybe it'd be something small. I'd be like, it'd be really great is for remote viewing and just consciousness and intuition and all these type of this whole field is there something we could find in North America, do geographical work on it, kind of get really good descriptions and drawings of it, and kind of just remote view the full spectrum from the beginning to the end about what this thing is, and then kind of bring it to the public. That'd be a really great day for just human capabilities and kind of showing to a larger audience that's not necessarily receptive to what humans are capable of doing with their minds and what consciousness is capable of. Kind of showing, hey, look at this really amazing artifact. We went and we found it. We brought it to the Smithsonian, what have you, and then kind of see what kind of comes from there. I'll get into the project at the end. It's the last one I'll go in tonight. The outcome of it was a lot larger. It's a bit bigger than we anticipated. But I guess remote viewing is a kind of a thing where, you get what you ask for. And so when we asked for the most significant, it's pretty much what we got. And it kind of blew all of us away exactly what this thing was, what it did, why it was there. And it wasn't exactly something that you could bring back to the Smithsonian. So I'll be getting into that. I'm talking about that artifact as well at the end of the webinar. So that and then after that, I can open up questions, Q&A, and any questions you guys have about the projects or questions for me about remote viewing or anything just on your mind. I'm happy to answer and kind of engage and talk about at the end. So that's kind of the roadmap for tonight. Hopefully I can get through it all without any complications. And if you have any questions, please though, if you hold them till the end, because it's going to be a little bit difficult for me to kind of answer them as I go. But there'll definitely be a time, write them down or keep notes of them because I'll be able to get to them afterwards. All right, so jumping in, I guess what's probably prudent to talk a little bit about, since not everyone here necessarily knows who I am, and since it's going to go on YouTube as well, I should kind of give a little bit of background, I suppose, about myself before I go into some specifics about remote viewing. And so who am I? I guess is a good question, right? Well, I'm Brett Stuart, and I've been doing remote viewing for almost close to 10 years now. A very specific version or technique of remote viewing, which is a structured technique. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But my background before, I didn't always do remote viewing. I originally went to school for political science, and I did parliamentary speech and debate at a university level, and then kind of was on a track to go to law school or go into politics. And some part of me unconsciously was like, I don't know if this is the direction you want to go. So I ended up switching over and doing art instead of pursuing that track. And I did graphic design as well as advanced character animation for a number of years before I eventually found remote viewing, or in kind of a way, remote viewing kind of found me. Because I actually didn't originally set out to kind of do this type of work originally. In 2010, I had an experience that kind of shook the foundation of my reality, that made me look inwards and kind of outwards as far as like my belief systems that I had built up of what I thought was real. Basically, the rug was pulled out from underneath me. And I was working on an indie animation project at the time. And I usually worked late nights, like 2, 3 in the morning, kind of a night owl. And as I was finishing up, back then I used to smoke cigarettes at the time. So I'd finish up, I'd go out back. Luckily I quit that a number of years ago, but I was in my mid-20s. And I was having a cigarette out back around 1 a.m., 2 a.m. in the morning. And this was in the San Francisco Bay Area. And there's a lot of light pollution. So I couldn't really, I was out looking at the stars, a couple stars that you could see. There weren't really a lot, but it was kind of a bright sky. And out of the corner of my eye, an absolutely massive triangle came from, there's a big hill, it's the Berkeley Hills, and came from it was on the left out of my peripheral vision, came right out of this, like slowly moving from one side of the sky right over my head to the other side of where I was staying, the apartment I was renting. And I'm there just standing, looking at this thing, my jaw's on the ground, and I cannot believe what I'm looking at, because this thing isn't moving like an airplane. It's moving very, very slowly. It has 3 bright lights at each tip of the corner, and then there was a dimmer red one in the center as it slowly kind of moved right over my head. And just to kind of give you a general size of what I was looking at in the sky. If you took maybe a softball and you held it at arm's length, that's about how big it was in the sky. It was fairly large, and I could just see the perimeter of it, kind of the edge of the triangle as it was moving over my head from the backdrop of the light pollution. And I mean, up to that point, I had never been interested in anything conspiratorial related, consciousness related for that matter. I was fairly agnostic on everything. Was born and raised Christian, but kind of in college, kind of became rather agnostic on most things. But never was really interested in UFOs or any of that kind of a field. I was much more, I suppose, I was looking for objective facts and reality, as I was kind of taught in school in political science. And this experience, if it was just that, I'm not sure I would have. It would have had the same impact if I'd just seen something in the sky. I probably would have easily just been, well, maybe it was some helicopters, maybe some drones. I mean, drones weren't really a big thing back then. They weren't really popular. So, but maybe it was just some interesting airplane that was just moving slowly, and I thought it seemed odd. But the thing that happened at the end that really shifted my whole view on reality was, after I'd say it was about 7 to 10 seconds maybe, as it kind of was going overhead, is it took off at what could really only be described as warp speed. This thing is moving very, very slowly, kind of over my head. And then as it got to, it actually went right over the roof of my house. And so I ran around to the other side of the house to the driveway to keep following, to keep tracking this thing, because I was so awed about what this thing was. And followed it. And then, as if on cue, as soon as I got to the front of the house, I kept watching it. This thing just like, you look at Star Trek when the ships just, engage, and the thing just blips, right, as fast as it can. That's essentially what I saw. Is I saw this thing in a snap of a finger from as far as I could see all the way to the horizon, which is pretty far from where I was. I could see pretty far. It just in an instant went past the horizon. The lights became a blur and disappeared over the horizon. And that experience, kind of seeing that, completely changed what I thought was real. It wasn't some story that someone had told me. It's like, oh, I've had this experience, or I've seen this light do a funny thing, or I've been abducted by aliens, or whatever it is. It was a firsthand experience that I had. And ever since then, ultimately, I actually have used remote viewing to look at that. It took a number of years for me to kind of build the courage to kind of see exactly what that was, for a number of reasons, which I don't really have time to go into now. But that kind of is what started me on the track to look into other things about, well, what is this reality? Because obviously I don't know anything. There's a lot that I don't know. And it started kind of with meditative techniques, kind of inner consciousness, what's there, as well as looking into the UFO field. I started listening to a lot of the different radio shows that are out there. I have a lot of respect for that kind of talk about these type of subjects. And then eventually I came to, I'd heard about it when I was a kid, a long time ago, because I listened to Art Bell years and years ago when I was like 13 years old. I had this little AM radio. I used to listen to it every once in a while because my great grandma actually listened to it, and she turned me on to it. But I heard about remote viewing on the radio way back when, and something dinged in my head. Hey, what about that remote viewing thing? Is that thing real? This is all during the period where I was kind of trying to figure out, what's real, what's not real. Things like that, what's true, what's not. And I picked up a training course, and kind of the rest is history, I guess. From there, I kind of decided to seek out a lot of the different remote viewing professionals that came out of the military program. I worked with a lot of them, trained with them. I kind of continued the practice on my own. And I've worked with a number of different groups since then, and that was since 2010. Kind of doing practice targets all the way up to operational targets on missing people, to optimum trajectory stuff, where it's like looking from, this is something that I do to support myself and kind of continue my work in like looking in consciousness, is doing different optimum trajectories for people, whether it's health related or career related, things like that. And but also, I mean, really the main thing that kind of got me into this was the enigmas, the mysteries. And I have about maybe 7 years worth of projects working with other professionals that kind of goes into that really looks at a lot of those types of stuff. And so my goal with this webinar series, my goal with the YouTube channel, and also just with the stories from the Matrix, is to kind of start just sharing some of this. Because, I really only talked with a few people about some of these projects. And, some of it's a little bit out there. When you start, because when you start remote viewing, you don't start with esoteric stuff. You don't start with looking at UFOs. It'd be a terrible remote viewer teacher to do that, because it's just a beginning remote viewer is not going to be able to ascertain what's their imagination from what's remote viewing data. But once you do it I really didn't start shifting over to enigmas with remote viewing until easily over a year worth practice. And you practice with photographs. So I'll be showing a couple examples of what that looks like here in just a minute. So anyway, that's kind of a little bit about me, though, and that's how I got into it. Some of you may be familiar with, I ran a website, the State of Reality Project, which was with a couple other remote viewers. Troika before this was also with a couple other remote viewers. I'm still working with other remote viewers, but life tends to pull people in different ways sometimes. There's a lot of talented viewers out there that I work with, and I think that will evolve over time as more people will get interested in it, and also just the different projects attract new viewers to kind of learn it. I also teach the skill as well. So yeah, that's kind of like how I got started. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end of the webinar. So a good place to start, though, so that's a little about me, is, well, if you're new, what is remote viewing, right? You probably have heard the term. Maybe that's why you decided to attend the webinar. A lot of you here, I'm familiar with a lot of the names here. And thanks for showing up and kind of supporting my endeavor with this. But kind of a quick overview of what exactly I'm talking about, I think, is important here. So remote viewing is a attention management skill. It's a skill that allows an individual to use their unconscious mind to access information about pretty much anything in the known universe: people, places, things, events, whether that's in the future, the present, or the past. Now, the future is a little bit more sketchy, and there's a lot of controversy on whether or not you're actually able to access 100% accurate data about the future, or whether it's a probable future that you're accessing. And I've had experience where I've had a lot of success actually remote viewing future events that did end up coming. I have had a lot of experience where future events also never came about, even though there was a lot of remote viewing work that very succinctly, blind by multiple viewers, said was going to happen. And so I think predictive work is certainly a field of remote viewing that needs more research, or just more kind of anecdotal experience to kind of understand how it works. It's like we're practitioners, but we're not necessarily the engineers of it. We're not able to kind of go back and understand necessarily the inner workings of why remote viewing works, because all we have really is our language, our own vocabulary to describe. And I think you may need like a new vocabulary to describe how consciousness may work at these levels. But what remote viewing does is it's a learnable skill. This is one common misnomer is really about remote viewing, is this something that someone just does. I'm just a remote viewer, a natural remote viewer. There are a lot of people who say that they're natural remote viewers. And if anything, they're natural psychics. They're naturally they're more maybe in tune with their intuition. But they're not necessarily a remote viewer. Remote viewers are those who follow a very specific protocol. And there's different types of techniques that differentiate. So there are those that came out of the military program, which I'm really not going to go into a lot tonight, because there's so much information out on the internet about the Stargate program. The U.S. military hired researchers and physicists to basically develop a structured technique that allowed people to access the part of their intuition and describe things at a distance. And they used this against the Russians during the Cold War. And there's a lot of information on YouTube and on the internet about this. So I'm really not going to go into that. But essentially from that, though, that structured technique, they learned how to teach it. And simultaneously, there was actually even at the same time that it was being developed by the U.S. military, there were those in the public sector completely unrelated to those researchers that were working for the CIA at the Stanford Research Institute that were also tinkering with consciousness abilities. And the Monroe Institute is one of them. There's a couple others that they didn't necessarily call it remote viewing at the time, but it was kind of like this. A lot of people were working on different experiments to see if human consciousness was able to describe or access a database or like a library. And this is where Stories from the Matrix comes from. It's essentially a library of information about the universe. And if a library exists, and this is not something you walk around in and pick a book up in, this is a non-physical library. But not only is it non-physical, it's also non-local. It's not something that doesn't exist in a specific space, like on Mars or something. This is something that simply exists non-locally, that's accessible. It's seemingly from our experience anywhere by consciousness and those by human consciousness. So what this allows then, though, what this allows for is that if we have a library that has information patterns about everything that exists in the universe, whether it's the cup of coffee I made this morning, to the event that happened a week ago, to something that may happen a week from now. If there's a non-local, non-physical library, a matrix, and it's actually where the word comes from, is then if that's accessible, what that means, the implications of that are pretty substantial. The implications of that are, if you can access it, is that we actually live in a world where there are no secrets. We live in a world where someone who is trained to be able to access this can find information about anything that they wish to direct their attention to within human limitations. Now, obviously, when we direct human attention to something, we're using our own understanding and vocabulary to describe it. So to give an example, I don't have a very good understanding of the way a nuclear power plant works, right? I don't. But I may have an analogy I might use that, well, the inner workings of a nuclear power plant, there's this vortex and it kind of spins, and maybe there's blades and there's heat and there's a lot of stuff. So I'm using my own vocabulary to describe it. And so maybe I'll use an analogy of something like, well, it's kind of like a blender. That's the best I can do. And then I have some general descriptors. Anything beyond my vocabulary or beyond something I can comprehend, even though it may exist, at least we theorize that it exists in this database, it's not going to be accessible by me or those who don't have the ability to comprehend it. So there's limits. There's limits to what can kind of be accessed. And so a lot of the stuff, when you start going and looking at things that exist, I'll give one example, which is life after death, is that you can certainly target this type of stuff with remote viewing, but a lot of the data that comes back when you start doing that is incredibly metaphoric. It's very difficult to understand what's going on. And it's because it's almost like we don't really have a frame of reference. We don't have a lot of vocabulary to describe what's happening and understand it very well. It's all analogy. It's all metaphor. And so ultimately, a lot of the remote viewing data that comes out of that is not incredibly useful. It may be interesting to think about, but nothing that really you could hang your hat on, I would say, at least in my own experience. Now, maybe that'll change in the future. Now, there are other techniques not remote viewing related. They're more experiential that I've looked at in that direction. Life after death, life between life, things like that, that are a little bit more useful than, say, a structured remote viewing approach. But essentially, this is what remote viewing does: is it's a moment-by-moment, structured and also learned technique that allows you to access your intuition at a deep level and pull out patterns of information from this library. And then this usually results in diagrammatic sketches as well as high-level descriptive data. And so, in a way, what I like to, when I teach this, what I like to tell my students is, in a way, remote viewing is a kind of thought catching, because the way the data comes in is you have to be able to remove the mental noise that you have in your mind about the information that's going on day to day, about what you have to do tomorrow, and also just pure imagination stuff, that if something's buzzing in yellow, your brain, your conscious mind is going to try and kind of bring a conclusion to what these this information is that you're downloading, so to speak. And it may give you an image of a bumblebee. It's like, well, it's the conscious imagination trying to make sense of what's going on in this structured process that connects you with, we use like this metaphor of like a signal line. It's like whether it's Wi-Fi or a phone or whatever analogy you really want to use to this database to get that information and bring it back to us in the session. But if you have noise on that line, you're not going to be able to get good information. It's going to actually be corrupted. And in fact, your analysis of it after the fact is going to be usually fairly far off from what the actual target is. So we practice this. We practice this at the beginning before we do any type of targets that don't have feedback. We practice it with photographs, because even if you take a photograph, let's say I take a photograph, and I'm going to show an example here in just a minute of what an example practice remote viewing session looks like. Just the full, like I want to really show you guys what the full structured session work looks like, so you can kind of compare results and see for yourself. Is that we do this because you need to be able to see how accurate you were. And if you're doing a target, which I ran very early on, once I started becoming more proficient with photographs, was, for example, the primary, what was it? This was the primary construction method for Giza, the Giza pyramids. That was something I was really interested in, in looking at. Before you do anything like that, and you start using this skill to look at that kind of stuff, you have to be able to hit a photograph, because a photograph is just as relevant an index in a library to be able to pull out that pattern of information and describe than the primary construction method for the Giza pyramids. And so, but you're not going to have any feedback for the Giza pyramid construction. You do have feedback for the photograph. You can take it out of the envelope and look at it and see how far off your session was. I mean, if you're describing the Eiffel Tower and the project was a photograph of, I don't know, a mountain, then obviously you're off and you have some more work to do. You have more practice to do. So there's calibration, there's calibrating that goes on, just practicing the structured method. There's also calibrating that goes on that we find even on the other end, is that the aspect of ourself that has the ability to kind of tap into this database also has to practice doing it. It has to get used to kind of being, we refer to it as the unconscious mind, being the part of you that kind of is the in-between. It goes to the library, picks up the pattern of information, brings it to you, and the way it gives it to you in the session is with spontaneous descriptors that show up in your mind when you're focused on it. And I'll show you how that kind of comes through here once I get into some of the examples. So, but if you have mental noise and you have the wrong target, you need to practice, just like anything else. You practice the piano, you practice a sport, you practice riding a bike, any of these kind of things you have to kind of practice, and then you build up that resiliency, and you have the feedback, and the immediate visual feedback of photographs is what actually where students really, and even for me when I just started in 2010, I had a lot of huge misses, and it was good though, because like I knew when I was off, but then at the same time I had some just dead on exact replicas of what the photograph was. And I'm going to show you guys one here in a minute of where it's just, when you just when you do it for yourself, really the first time, the real way that's like a skeptic kind of goes in, like, I really don't think you can convert a skeptic to believe anything they don't want to believe. But the only way that they're going to, like, I think, change their mind about remote viewing, if they're kind of a diehard, I'm not going to look at the evidence, or I don't believe consciousness abilities exist, or that the human mind is larger than just a bunch of gray matter. Like, I think the real way to change someone's mind is to actually have them try it themselves. Because oftentimes what they'll run into is they'll have a first-time effect, to where it's the first time their mind has ever operated in that way, and so they haven't really they don't have any built-in parameters or just kind of internal mind functions that would prevent it from occurring. And so they just say, well, it's not going to work. And so they just go with that mentality and they just do what they're told. And that kind of just doing what they're told to go through the steps actually allows it to work. And then they actually, oftentimes in the very first 1 or 2 sessions that even a skeptic run is pretty good, as they tend to be. Not always, but it can be. So kind of the novelty effect. can occur with photographs, which is kind of interesting. So it's a really great way to kind of convince skeptics, is just to teach them like a really basic form of RV, have them try it themselves, just to describe a photograph by going through a couple stages, a couple steps, and then seeing how accurate they actually end up getting. And so it's almost like the more they don't believe it can occur, it's like they're not caring about what the result is. And the not caring is what allows them to actually get out of the way and actually hear the spontaneous descriptors that come in, that I like to kind of refer to in the remote viewing session as thought catching. Because that's really what remote viewers are, is they're catching the thoughts that are being kind of served up by the unconscious. And that's my phone. Just turn that off. So I'm going to show an example here. Let me switch my screen. I want to show, this is just the first example of a photograph before I kind of go into discussing a few other things. Oftentimes, this isn't a full session. This is a very small chunk of a session. And it's drawings and remote viewing are very diagrammatic. It's one of the reasons why I'm very hesitant. And I know a lot of viewers are very hesitant to kind of show their full session work, because people are going to go, what is this chicken scratch? And I'll show you what I mean by chicken scratches, because it's actually part of the process and kind of connecting to what we refer to as the signal line and downloading that information pattern. There's a reason behind that. But even the diagrams, the drawings, they're very, very simplistic. And a lot of people are not good drawers, and it doesn't look that great. And so even though the work at the end of the day, you take it, you can write a very concise summary about what the remote viewing data says. You can paint a verbal picture and a narrative about the meaning behind it, because you're using your vocabulary to describe it. And if you follow what the data said in the session without kind of going off in analysis into imagination land, then that's the type of information you can share in like a verbal story, or do some like artistic renderings of something, which I've done in the past to paint a picture for people to follow along. Whereas if you kind of show some of the work that is not kind of prettied up, people might take make the wrong conclusions. But so that's part of this experiment, to kind of see if this makes sense, to kind of start doing. And I think it's probably good to do anyway. I don't know to what degree, but this is an example of a photo target. And this is only a partial session. So this is what's referred to as a stage 3. Stage 3 is drawing, typically. And there's different techniques out there. There's what's referred to as controlled remote viewing, which a lot of people practice, which is what came out of the military. There's a lot of kind of derivatives of controlled remote viewing. I practice one that's a derivative of it, that changes the structure slightly, but it still uses the same step-by-step methodology, pen on paper, attention management skill. So stage 3 is drawing. So as you can see, it's very, very diagrammatic. It's very, very simple. And it's often because we don't want really high-level sketches and sessions, because if you're doing that, you're really going to you run the risk of kind of engaging the imagination. And so much of this process is about fending off imagination. It's about getting rid of the mental noise. That was like the key that unlocked this with the researchers, is that if they could find a way to get people to lower the signal to noise ratio of information that was coming in once they connected with a signal pattern, if they could do that, then their data would become more pristine and their data would get better. And so if you spend so much time drawing, you're going to very quickly go into imagination. It's almost kind of like in a remote viewing session, you're Indiana Jones and you got a boulder chasing you, except the boulder's not going to flatten you. The boulder is your imagination. And if you don't kind of stay ahead of it, it's going to run you over, and the whole session was just kind of a waste. So you're kind of constantly trying to outpace your imagination. So simplistic drawings, diagrams are really kind of important for the process to work. This is very simple. I have just kind of 2 rings here, kind of wavy rings. I have this tall and kind of looks like a cedar mushroom, kind of a diagram, just drawing. Very, very simple. And down here, this was my boulder chasing me in the session. I had as soon as I finished drawing this, from the diagram, I had this picture in my mind of an atomic bomb explosion. I was like, oh, it looks like that. And I know in the session, because of the techniques that I've learned, because of the process, that anything that's really high level at this point of the game, I can't really be trusted at all. And so we refer to this noise as overlay. And if it's very specific, we essentially call it AOL, or analytic overlay. And so this is one of the techniques, is by writing it out. It's a way for us to kind of discharge it, to get rid of it. And that kind of technique, even in normal life, whether it's an emotional discharge or something else, I find even like meditation it's like cross applicable. Is that by declaring something, writing it down kinesthetically, just even writing something, like if I have an emotion that from the day I can't really get past, writing it down. I mean, people talk about this, not just, for a long time. Journaling has a therapeutic effect, right? Well, why? It's because you're essentially, you are objectifying what this internal noise is that you have, this emotion that's kind of grunting on the hamster wheel. You're writing it down, objectifying it, and by doing that, it kind of allows you to discharge it. And so we do this in remote viewing sessions with any type of high-level ideas that we refer to kind of as the imagination, the mental noise, guesses. There's a bunch of different classifications of it. And so I had that picture. I couldn't trust it, essentially, at this stage, so I had to get rid of it. So I objectified it and moved on. The next thing you move on to, and again, you have to, we do this very quickly, so our handwriting is not real pretty, is we start describing things more detailed. And so I'll try and just run through this real briefly, because I have a lot to kind of get to tonight. But over here, and these are essentially columns. And over here, see, I can over here. Over here, these are sensory and dimension columns. And in this stage, this is referred to as a stage 4, is essentially spontaneous descriptors depending on, they're kind of bracketed in all these columns. Sensory, so that's smells, tastes, textures, there's a bunch of others. And then dimensions, and that can be motions, densities, and dimensions. We kind of just, we catch the thought as it kind of comes in. And so we've connected with the signal pattern, and now we're going to start describing it in a very low-level form, whatever it is. And when we're running the session, we don't know what it is. We're completely blind. So I had no idea what the target was. I simply was essentially given a set of numbers. But as I described, whatever this particular photograph was, is that I described it as tall, round, and wavy. There's something that's brilliant, bright, wet red, and gray here. And I kind of got some of the temperatures, humid, sounds, I had chirping, so very low-level sensory data. But I mean, this is the type of thoughts. And when you start remote viewing, you really don't, it changes the way that you kind of look at your surrounding reality. Because by practicing these methods, it forces you to break events and information down in a way we typically don't do. We do unconsciously. So you look around your room right now, just what are the colors around the room? That maybe you're more familiar with. What about the textures? What's the texture of the wall? What's the texture of the keyboard? What's the texture of the computer monitor? And then sounds, what type of sounds exists more than just loud and quiet? It's like, and then also temperatures. I mean, a lot of those people are familiar with, but smells, tastes, temperatures, colors, and then dimensions. But like looking at it one by one and kind of breaking it down in that way almost acts as kind of a lattice work for the viewer to climb up and actually grab high-level information. And so we'll start our stage 4s like that. And so the last bit of information we have over here, after it kind of built up with low-level information, was just more information about whatever the photograph was. And I described, now you'll see here, these are all right here. These are all AOLs. I had a very chatty mind in this session. And a chatty mind, mental noise, I had to get rid of it. So I had, even it showed up again here at the top, I had AOL, old bomb photo. I had AOL, bug, World War II, bird, a party, hybrids. Like I had, I don't know, just a lot of random mental noise that I knew was noise I couldn't trust, and so I discharged it. But the data that did come through for this one was very straightforward. It wasn't, I mean, this is like a third of one remote viewing session I'm showing you. You do this multiple times. We refer to them as explorations. But it's what we do here, what's described here is that I'm dealing with a place, and there's an activity or endeavor, there's like a hustle and bustle that's going on here at the site. And there's people here shows that they're happy. They feel like they've had some sort of a success or a victory over an accomplishment. So something's been achieved here by these people that they're really happy about. And but it's like a large, I mean, this is like the endeavor activity, it seems like an undertaking of a pretty sizable feat here that people have accomplished. And then so kind of merging the sensory dimension with the high level data, that's when we typically will write a summary to try and understand data analysis. Okay, what are our postulates? What do we have here? But for just photographs, when you learn how to do this, you don't necessarily have to go all the time go into data analysis, because you're getting the immediate visual feedback. For this one, the immediate visual feedback for this target was actually, my AOLs were right on for this. This was the photograph I was remote viewing. And it actually was an atomic bomb explosion. But, obviously in the session, I couldn't know that. And so when I got that impression in the session, this high-level idea of a bomb going off or an atomic bomb going off, I couldn't trust it. So I had to still discharge it. I had to stay within the structure. But kind of after I finished the work, I would know, like, if I continued to do more remote viewing work on this, and it kept coming up again and again and again in these high-level stages, World War II, explosions, bombs, that's when, noise tends to go away after a while. Once you discharge it, you kind of sever that cord so long as you kind of follow the techniques properly. But data, if you accidentally discharge it when it is actually data, it'll just keep coming up until you write it down. And so there's a couple of different neat tricks you can do in data analysis to kind of ferret out what is noise, what is imagination versus what is actual accurate information and intuition that was on target that accurately kind of pulled information off the signal line. So this is just an example of one photo session. It's kind of straightforward. It's easy to kind of understand of what beginners, once they start practicing and keep becoming proficient, can do. And typically it really depends on the individual. But I've seen beginners, I've worked with students that can do this as early as the first couple of days. So obviously there's ups and downs, there's different plateaus to kind of break through. For the, depending on who you are and kind of how naturally gifted you are at it. When I started, I was not good. I had a novelty effect where I hit a couple at the very beginning that kind of blew my mind, like, oh my goodness, I think this is real. And then for about a month straight, I couldn't hit a single photograph. It was very depressing. I was questioning, okay, I'm not sure, am I faking this? Am I reading into this? Or is there actually something here? And so it took a lot of, originally I'm very much psychic as rock, I think, when I started this. But once I started practicing it, and it was kind of the drive to continue, and the drive that there's very much a perfectionist in me to get something right. And it kind of kept me going because I was so intrigued in the experience I had to keep trying to see if I could do it. And eventually something clicked and I was able to do it. But I've worked with a lot of students that picked it up much more quickly than me. Even in the first day, they started hitting photo targets. And that doesn't mean that I recommend it. Okay, go look at Mars now, or whatever enigma, if that's kind of floats your boat. But it's the kind of thing, that's where you start. But this is what it looks like. And this is the type of basic work you can do. And it's the kind of thing that it showed me that there's something to this, because I started getting kind of identical matches between what my diagrams looked like and my descriptions and then the photographs. And then I was able to repeat that process over and over again. And then other beginners that I worked with, because I remember this is one of the things we'll probably be talking about maybe at the end of the month, maybe in the next webinar. But it's really my goal to try and create a remote viewing community that is open to a lot of the different methodologies out there. One of the things that when I began, the remote viewing community that exists out there is very, very fractured. There's a lot of different groups that don't talk to each other because has a very tumultuous history of a lot of the different people out there and who don't get along very well. And, I'm not going to really talk about names or different people out there, because I have really no intention of that. My goal is, I think this now is a really good time, and I think it's needed. I think it would be good. It would be good to create a community where people have access to remote viewing skills, access to a new community. That's not about, hitting someone over the head that I have the best way of doing it. And it's like, well, let's create a community that's more results oriented. So that if you have a structure that's a little bit different than someone else's, okay, but how good is your data? And make it a results oriented as opposed to like a dogma oriented. This is the only way to remote view, and if you don't do it my way, then you're a heretic. So I think it's unfortunate that there's a lot of communities out there that are like that. They're very, very dogmatic, and it's kind of my hope through some of the work that I'm doing, some of the other work that I know that's going on by other remote viewers out there that they're doing, that there can be collaboration and kind of a community and be built up to really show that people have this amazing skill, that they can do these amazing things themselves. And, the act of actually doing remote viewing is not that hard. It's actually not. Well, it's hard in the sense that you have to stick with it, just like anything, but it's much simpler to go through a structure, a remote viewing session, than it is to learn how to play a piano. That's much, much simpler. But to become a master at playing the piano, I would say become a master at remote viewing does take a lot of dedication, because it does take a lot of practice. And there's a lot of pitfalls that you can run into with analysis, and that comes with time as you kind of learn. And I had to kind of learn a lot of that myself, just by doing it over the years. Like I've had a lot of failures out there, I would say, in remote viewing that pitfalls I wasn't aware of. And I kind of had to go through and kind of learn from, to see kind of what works. So I think before I move on though, let me actually show you a couple other examples here. I'm going to show another example here. This is a project I ran for one of the military, one of the pros that came out of the military, and it was on. I did this project for them, and this was on the location of a missing person, and the way that. And so this was about 3 years after I had started. I'd been doing a lot of practice targets. I got my accuracy level very high, up to about 80%, where I could trust about 80% of my descriptive data. I knew just through practice was going to be correct. And so there's still mental noise, but typically you can ferret that out with good data analysis skills. So I did this project for this other viewer, and what the target was is it was looking for this skull, the location of this missing person's skull, because it was just a missing person, murdered, didn't really know, just wanted to see, okay, well, wherever that is, usually there's teeth in that, it can be identifiable. Let's describe the location wherever this thing is. And so I'm going to go through this. I have a lot to get through, but I kind of want to just briefly show what a full session looks like here. And we typically write summaries of sessions, but this is the chicken scratch I was kind of referring to before. That this is what's called an ideogram. And an ideogram, you can think of it as when you're connecting to, it's like a Wi-Fi internet, you're at a coffee shop or at home, you have to connect to your network. This is that act of connecting to the network. These are essentially line scribbles that once you write out a prompt, in this case, it's the number. So I had no idea at the time that this was a missing person. All I was given were these numbers right here. And so essentially what I did is I wrote out these numbers, and then I created a kinesthetic mark on the page. And there's a whole history that I'm really not going to go into. I talked about this in my classes, about why it works. And but suffice to say, for our purposes tonight, this is the connection that is established. It's a download of a pattern of information through these marks. They're called ideograms. They were discovered by René Warcoli, actually, in the 30s. So this is the beginning of the session. We continue on. We do some more work where we're basically going through very low-level stuff, going through sensory, textures, colors. We're thought catching at this point. And so spontaneous descriptors that are coming in through textures, colors, then smells, tastes, and then temperatures, and then sounds, and then dimensions. We're writing these down on the page, and we're doing it in a spontaneous manner. There's a little bit more to it, but this is kind of what this page entails. Not really going to go too much more into the rest of what the session work is. I'm going to jump kind of to the end here, because each session is about 16 pages. It takes it depends on the speed of the viewer. Beginners, usually it takes about 45 minutes to complete one session. So this is work. I mean, you have to sit down and you have to focus for 45 minutes to get one session done. So if you're running a project and you need to run a couple sessions, I mean, you're looking at a couple of hours worth of work, if not more. If if things are unclear by the end, it can take anywhere up to 10, sometimes 10 plus hours worth of work to kind of get a really solid answer about something. So it's not for everybody, but kind of what comes out of the work can be very, very pristine. So I'm going to show you what comes out of a final session. So what comes out of a final session right here is this final page, and it's called a site template. And a site template is taking all of the information through all these different explorations, leading up to page 16 here. And it's like a jigsaw puzzle that we put together. And still, it's very, very diagrammatic. And we include the high-level descriptive data on this diagram, and then we kind of fit all the drawings together and how they kind of are oriented and relate to one another. So on this one, you'll see the diagram here, just so you can look at what this is here. It describes that I have something that's being placed over, and it's a ramp. So I have like some sort of a ramp that's curving off in two directions. On the ramp here, there's a reflective sign. It's kind of really just basic nouns that I'm describing high level here. And then underneath it here, there's like this scattering. Something's been launched and thrown. It came to rest. It was discarded here. Again, I had no idea at the time that this was the location of a skull, but I had this idea of like it's ceremonial almost, like where something's organized, like a ceremony for the dead or something like that. But there's these cement structures here that are underneath it, these cement tubes, and it's like scattered in pieces in these tubes underneath this ramp. Really, really basic. It was only one session. Probably, I think I only ran one session on this. But I got feedback later after the session work came back, after I turned this session work in, that this was a missing persons case. Obviously, this isn't real. These results aren't real great for finding the missing person, considering that the site is describing that there's something over the top. This ramp is over the top of these tubular cement structures, and there's this thing that's scattered. So likely analysis of that without even really doing more work, you can probably make the good postulate that the skull was kind of in bits and kind of it's spread out underneath this. And I was given feedback actually on where there was location work that was done on where this skull was. And my work, actually I'm going to show you here. Here is the location work that was done. There's a pinpoint on, this is a Google Maps of where the remote viewing location work came back to. And what it was essentially pointed to a landfill. This is a landfill with a road that was put over the top. Underneath here on the side, it was all, if you go back actually to this location on Google Maps, or Google Earth, I'm sorry, you'll see actually a whole bunch of these cement tubes that were filled with garbage. And then what they do is they put dirt over the top of it. And then they built a road over the top of it. And so diagrammatically, even from my work, even just one session, it wasn't even a full project. It actually matched exactly what the location work showed of where the skull was. Again, not real, right here, if you zoom in though, I'll zoom in here and show you guys. So here's a road. There's the ramp that kind of matches up what my work is. I have a reflective sign here. There's some signs right here on where this triangle is. And then underneath here, if you look in this area right here, is where all the cement tubes are for the landfill, which is where my remote viewing work said the skull was. So not real good results for retrieving that, considering it was fragmented and in the bottom of a landfill. It'd be a little bit difficult to find that. But this is a kind of a real world example of what at least a single, it's not a full project, a single remote viewing session looks like. And the type of kind of diagrammatic accuracy that you can get in your session work. So the next one I want to show is maybe something that everyone is a little bit more fascinated about here. I don't know, maybe not. I was fairly interested in it, considering why I got interested in remote viewing in the first place, which was the triangle that I saw that went over my head. And this is a remote viewing example that I did a number of years ago for another individual that actually had direct chain of custody. It was their friend. I think it was his friend's mom or his parents. So direct family connection for a photograph of something in the sky. And I have the photograph, which I'll show at the end of the work. But I want to show kind of how remote viewing work kind of attacks a problem set and describes what is going on at the site in this diagrammatic way. That is how we get our information to describe and create project information about it. So this is the third example I want to show of a target before I get into Bitcoin, Nazca mummies, and the final one, the artifact project. So this one, I'm not going to spend too much time on this work on the beginning. I'm going to kind of spend most of the time at the end. But connecting, this was actually at the top here, you'll notice of this session. So this is 2014. This is a while ago. I was actually experimenting on this session at the time with TDCS, which is, if you're familiar with that, it's short for not TDC, it's TCDS. It's interesting, I wrote it wrong. It's transcranial direct current stimulation. Maybe it is TDCS. I don't know. It's been a while since I've used it. What it is you use very, very low level electrical impulses placed in strategic parts on the head, and you perform certain repetitive activities. And I was experimenting with one of these early devices to see if it had any effect on remote viewing. And as far as the work, a couple of viewers, we all kind of put some money together to buy a couple of these devices, and then we did our own experiments to see if it had any like positive benefits. And from what we could tell, it really didn't affect the work that we were doing. The research that's been out of there has been coming out of the university or UC Davis in California on TDCS, and it shows that it's most helpful. I mean, this is like super, super low level like current stimulation, so like almost not noticeable. So we're not zapping batteries or anything like that, and sticking our fingers in the wall socket. But what they found with the research out there, the literature out there on it, shows that when you learn something new, that actually can help create kind of the connect the neurons for something what we refer to as clicking, or the eureka moment, is that it can speed up the process of getting there. And since all of the viewers had already been remote viewing for a number of years, we kind of just, it was more of an experiment to see if it had an effect, and really we didn't. So that's what this is up here is, we started with a certain voltage, full session, just kind of, it was kind of a fun little anecdote. But anyway, so experimented with that. But this session, so I was using it in this session, and this is in 2014. So I went through the session. I'm just going to kind of go through this kind of quickly here. First kind of diagrammatical sketch I had in the session was I had this cylinder and something was kind of wrapped really tightly around it. I had these two things coming off of it. It was spinning. And so I had high-level data here of something was embracing and clutching. That was that wrapped kind of cord. Multi-purpose, it's conductive, it's like a band, and tightly wrapped. So very, very basic. It's kind of think of like the jigsaw puzzle. This is one tiny part of the jigsaw puzzle that then at the end is going to connect with the rest of the jigsaw puzzle. I could do another exploration here, and here I have another diagram of it, and I kind of have like this kind of pointed thing there's the spinning part on top, and it has like this wavy tail coming off the back of it. And my high-level data describing it is this is a man-made object. It's technical. It reminds me of something like a radio. It has a tail, and it's what's this device is part of a larger system. That's what COG is. It's using my vocabulary to describe that this is part of something bigger. And it's like flattening and rolling. It's just describing the kind of the maneuvering that this device is doing. And it seems like what the work says is it's seeking a measurement out for wherever location this thing is in. Final exploration. The drawing is what this is, because again, this all comes in at the end. As here's the motion it's kind of going through. I have this thing kind of going like this through the sky. And so even my high level data here is this is propelled. It's like a rocket. It's in the sky. This thing is connecting to something. It's transmitting. It's aerial. It's prompting. It almost has this like, look at me kind of a thing. It's very visual. And that's all I got for the session work. But it all comes together on a single site template, diagrammatic in nature, where here I have the device that kind of overlapped. Here's all the information I had about it, and then here's the activity it's kind of doing, moving across the sky in this kind of interesting manner, kind of spinning around. So the photograph after that, though, and this is really not that enigmatic from the remote viewing data. It's very, very straightforward. If I were to look at this without even looking at, for even you guys looking at this work, you can kind of get an idea of what this is without even looking what the photograph is. So it's just some sort of a device that's in the sky. It's like this look at me kind of thing. Maybe there's a light on it. It's just a man-made device that's looking for measurements from wherever this thing's at. Has like a tail that's coming off of it, so maybe it's kind of visual. And the picture this is the picture that the project was set up for. And as I did the work, this is the protocol that remote viewing uses, is that the viewers never know what the actual remote viewing target is. Only in very, very selective cases do you ever run anything front loaded, and even then you have to be very, very careful, and typically it needs to be corroborated by a second viewer that's done it blind before you ever trust something that's been done front-loaded. Front-loaded meaning they know what the target is, not necessarily what the outcome of the remote viewing session is, but they know what the target is. So this is another example of the power of remote viewing, is that this solved this mystery. It was an enigma. And it was my friends, their parents, they'd seen this a couple nights, and they finally decided to take a picture. This was, I think, out over Lake Michigan, I think is where this light was. It was 2012. They're on the, if you can see that, 2012 was the date of that photograph. And so they saw it a couple nights, and they just thought it was really, really strange. And so they took a picture of it. So there's the tail, there's a thing going across the sky. Nothing really, no aliens here. No, it's just a man-made device that's collecting information in the sky, and this is very visual. And it's almost like they put lights on this thing and a tail to, draw attention to it. I don't know. I could have done more work to see. Here's the thing about remote viewing site template. This page right here. This page right here can be used as a springboard. You can use this thing right here to launch off into as much or more remote viewing work as you possibly want to do. You can take a microscope and you can zoom in or pull out. If I wanted to look at the primary function of this device, I could do that with another remote viewing session. If I wanted to look at who made this, I could shift, and it could shift to a different target, to who made this device. I could go to the purpose, the primary function of the device. There's a whole lot of these are referred to as movements that you can do on this, like as a springboard off of, and this can launch into, one of the one I'll talk to kind of at the end of the night. I'll ultimately end up doing probably a number of multi-length webinars potentially on it, or just long YouTube videos on it, talking about the artifact project that I've actually spent more than 2 years, not it's like 2 years in session, but 2 years remote viewing with about 5 other viewers, because we found it so fascinating. And obviously we had to set up the project in a way that we were always blind to the work. So there was like delays between one session to the next. But you can spend as much time. You could look at something for your entire life, I guess, if you found it just interesting or fascinating to look at. But this was just one session. A lot of times you can solve the problem. What is this? Is this thing real? Is this thing fake? Is there something more going on here? Pretty quickly in about one session. And so this was one session that it was an enigma that kind of came back. We kind of understood what was going on here. So those are the 3 examples I wanted to show tonight about what remote viewing could do and what's possible with it. And there's one thing before I start getting into some of the larger projects. This kind of begs a couple really big questions that I want to just briefly talk about. And the first one is, and I mentioned this, if any of you listen to the radio interviews that I've done on the Jimmy Church Show or on John B. Wells, I brought this up, but I think it's worth repeating almost any time I kind of talk about this, because I think no one else talks about this, I feel, that does remote viewing, at least that I've really heard of. At least they don't stress it. But it's this idea that if information about everything exists out there, you can use remote viewing to pull back secrets that people keep. You can use it because essentially this is a library that has information about everything. But the question is, should you? The question is, do you have the right Who gives someone the right to, let's say, look at someone else's uppermost thoughts or deepest secret? And is that ethical? And what are the ethics behind remote viewing? And I feel like that's a kind of a discussion that has never really been had, or if it has, it's not discussed very often. And I think it's something that should be discussed. But I mean, there's not enough necessarily maybe professional remote viewers out there that it matters. But, it's most people who get into remote viewing, from my experience, they're very fascinated by it. But they're interested more from like a tourist perspective. They kind of want to see how it works. They're fascinated by it. They'll do some remote viewing for maybe a couple months to do some photographs. And then they notice kind of how much work this is you actually have to sit down and focus for 45 minutes. And if you're doing a project, it could be a couple hours worth of work. And a lot of people would prefer to do something that is a little bit, the instant gratification kind of culture. So they'll go to something that's a little bit easier, I guess, on that department. There are other remote viewing methods out there that are more experiential. One is referred to as extended remote viewing, which I'm also I've done a lot of experimenting with. And that's, if anyone's familiar, it kind of was born out of the Monroe Institute partially, and then merged with some of the other structured techniques that came out of the military. Monroe is the Monroe Institute that does the out-of-body projection type of meditation, binaural beat type of stuff. And so it's very visual. You kind of enter an altered state of consciousness by quieting your mind, and then it's a directed step-by-step process of experiencing a sight, as opposed to a structured technique, which is what I'm showing everyone tonight and here in the video, where you're not experiencing your target here. What you're doing with structured remote viewing, and whether it's CRV or any of the derivatives, which I do, you essentially are describing it, but you're not bilocating. You're not, at no point in time in any of this work, it's a grave error, actually, in fact, if I ever do this in the session, if I ever feel when I'm doing this work, I'm more present at where this device is, this man-made device, like, I feel like I'm there. I can see it, almost like as if I open my eyes, I see it. That's what's referred to as bilocating. If that ever happens, it's a big, big error in structured remote viewing, because if you do that, it's like the liminal gate. I mean, there's more. I mean, I don't want to get too technical, but essentially what can happen is it can shut very quickly, because what happens is there's a protective mechanism that exists in our minds that if we get too close to a target or too close to something non-local information, that it becomes more real than what we are. If it can, unless we're in a very, very, let's say, an altered state, like I'm laying down in a meditative state and I'm kind of projecting out of body or something like that, and that's a discussion for a different night, then what can happen is that there's a protective mechanism that the gate, that's the kind of the information is kind of coming through, will slam shut. Because imagine you're walking down the street and you suddenly had access and you feel like you're more somewhere else than where you're at, crossing the sidewalk. Well, you're not going to be able to, the protective mechanism to not get hit by a car or have something in your environment cause irreparable harm to you, you're no longer going to be able to do that. And so there seems to be some sort of a gatekeeper there, that if you get too close in this type of an environment, that the information gate shuts. And when it shuts, you don't actually necessarily know in the remote viewing session. So all the data that comes out after that is typically all nonsense. It's all noise. And so it's a part of the structure keeps the remote viewer from actually engaging too specifically or too closely to bilocate. And so it's like just the thoughts, just the information that's coming through, just diagrams. Anything more than that, I have to discharge, I have to get rid of, and I have to make sure I don't do. But there are other techniques that are a little bit more experiential, but kind of going full circle here of where this came off, the point this came off of is that there's, a lot of people that get fascinated with this, realize it's a lot of work, and then they don't want to continue doing the work because it's, it's time intensive. And so not everyone, a lot of people would prefer someone else to do the work and then share the information with them, which is fine. A lot of people don't have the kind of time to invest in remote viewing to get to a proficient level. So anyway, that's a little bit of background about, just about kind of the ethics maybe behind it, the problems with it, I think that there's, maybe there'll be a community one day that can have that kind of discussion. And because you can target someone's deepest secrets if you wanted to. It's not that information about reality. When you look at it through this lens, you have to really change how you look at it. About what you even think becomes the domain of anyone who has the capability to look. And so what that means is you suddenly become responsible even for what your thoughts are. And I think where we're moving now, this is just a guess based off some remote viewing work, but I think we're going, I hope actually, where we're going is that, as consciousness tools become more widespread and more accepted in society, this is one of the big hurdles one of the big questions we're going to kind of have to confront is, do I have the right to look at someone's, uppermost thoughts? Does someone have the right to look at mine? And it's not really, smarter people than me will have to have those discussions, I think. But, that's a question for another day, perhaps. But anyway, so I kind of want to move on here to a couple of the projects. The first one I wanted to share tonight, so it's a switching of gears for a little bit, but the first one I want to talk about is cryptocurrency. And cryptocurrency, we looked at, myself and a couple other viewers, back in June. And we decided to look at the long-term impact of Bitcoin and Ethereum. Back then, Bitcoin hadn't made the explosion yet where it was, where it's at today. It almost went up to, I believe, $20,000 US per coin. Then it crashed all the way down to 12,000. I don't even know where it's at today. It's going crazy up and down. But we also looked at Ethereum, which is another type of blockchain. And just to go super quick primer, if people don't know what cryptocurrency is or what the blockchain is, it's funny. Most people probably even investing in Bitcoin don't know what it is, but they know it's going up in price. And so they're trying to jump on the bandwagon. So they're investing in things. They don't even know how it works. So, I don't know if that's a recipe for disaster. Well, I guess we'll see I'll show you what the remote viewing data says about it. And this is something that I plan on doing actually more work on. So the data I'm going to share with you is work that was done in June of this last year. And it's the specifics data. And there's some very big key points that came out in here. And we looked at anywhere between 6 months to 3 years is about how far this kind of data looks. So the first one we looked at was Bitcoin. And the long-term impact, as we start with the same type of session work, which I'm not really going to go. I'm going to jump directly to the site template to show you the diagrammatic representation here of what the data says. And when we get to this is a much more recent. So there's a lot of data here. And so just kind of to the untrained eye, unless I kind of explain what this says, you may not fully, hopefully that's all on the screen. Yeah. So what's going on here is diagrams, because Bitcoin is it's a non-tangible thing. We're talking about something that exists simply in computers, ones and zeros. This is an artificial currency, and kind of a really quick, if you never heard of Bitcoin on what this is it's a way of, let's see, what's the easiest way to kind of describe what this is? You can kind of think of a ledger or a book. And each transaction, say you're at a store, that ledger, there's a new line, a new transaction that someone might write at a store for every transaction that goes on. If you come into my store, I give you an object, you give me $5, I'll put that on my ledger, and then it'll always be in my ledger as a recording. The blockchain in Bitcoin essentially is a global ledger of transactions between millions of different computers, and they all have the same ledger. So, and there's this thing called a Bitcoin that is a illusory thing just made up of ones and zeros. Essentially, it's just like a variable on a computer that's designated a number, 1 Bitcoin, 2 Bitcoins. And it's a lot more complicated than this. I'm trying to make it really simple. But everyone has this ledger around the world. It's the same ledger, essentially. And so if I make one transaction, say I send you $100 in Bitcoin, that ledger, everyone's ledger is going to be updated with that. And so what this does is it decentralizes who has the books, who has the books. A bank doesn't have it. A company doesn't have it. Everybody has it. And because everybody has it, it makes it so that if something was hacked, or like if a bank was hacked, or if a company was compromised, something was altered, you wouldn't really have a problem, because it's a self-correcting system. That's because everyone kind of has this ledger that if one out of the 1,000 is off, well, majority rules, and then that one discrepancy gets overruled by everybody else. And so there's this illusory amount that are then used as currency. Well, I have a Bitcoin, and you can trade, and it's been given value. And it's way, way more complicated than this, but I'm just trying to kind of keep it simple. Our remote viewing data about Bitcoin, though, the long-term impact for Bitcoin is not real promising. It's not real promising. So it doesn't show it completely devastated, but it shows it incredibly entrenched and embattled. So diagrammatically, we're talking about something abstract here, so we're not going to draw objects in this website. We may draw something metaphorically, and that's actually what happened here a little bit. But up here, you can kind of look, you can think of this, this is Bitcoin. And I drew a line here in my site template. This is a globally connected grid network, and there's separation. So globally connected, that's what's going on with Bitcoin already. So I'm describing, I know I'm on target here. What's going on with this thing, though, here, you see all these lines that are kind of these separate pathways that are coming off of it. There's the up and down. And I can remember when I ran the session, I had no idea actually what this was. So it was very like, what am I dealing with here? Some global network? So when I was in the analysis stage. But long-term impact of Bitcoin shows it entrenched and embattled, and that there is a fight for pricing control on this that seems to be going on in the long term. And it bounces around like a pogo stick. So if you ever are remote viewing data for Bitcoin, is that if you hope that it's going to stabilize anytime soon, a remote viewing work shows that it's actually very, very not going to be the case. That here my work described as barriers are going to be erected for control. This idea of the pogo stick, it going up and down, and also showing that it divided and split. And so metaphorically here on our data analysis, also based off of other sessions work, we believe that Bitcoin very likely will continue to split as the years go on. It doesn't show it going away. It doesn't necessarily showing it completely crashing. Well, I'll get to the next one. Maybe the long-term effect of Ethereum may have actually some more information about it. But the thing that's going on with Bitcoin as far as long-term, the key information showed up. So this was kind of describing it being entrenched, going up and down, and it also kind of not really stabilizing ever, at least in the long term. The other thing that's going on that's relevant is down here diagrammatically in the remote viewing session, which is it shows like this roulette wheel. And so it's spinning around and around and around and around. And it shows that there's an action, like a fractional skimming off the top every time something is occurring that's happening in a grand scale. So here's what this data is: shifting hands, a percentage of net worth. So it's almost like from one pocket to the next, that there are people, and if you read more and you learn more about how Bitcoin works, you can understand some of the more specifics. But is that this is what's going on with Bitcoin is that a lot of people just, it's like the rich are getting richer with it. Those who have a substantial stake with Bitcoin, it's almost like they're transitioning money from one wallet or one pocket to another pocket. And by just that transaction that's taking place, it's like they're making more money out of thin air. And so a system that exists like that, I suppose it makes sense that it's not going to end up being very stable in the long term. Whether or not that it completely disappears, that's not what the remote viewing work says. It shows it, though, that it's going to be embattled and entrenched for a long time, and that it's not, the up and down is going to continue to bounce around. And so I wouldn't recommend. I read an article that a Japanese company decided to offer their employees paying them in Bitcoins. I just think that's just the most crazy idea, because if one day a Bitcoin is worth $15,000 and then tomorrow a Bitcoin is worth $8,000 and you're getting paid in a set amount of Bitcoin, I would not want that. I would not want that paycheck. So it's something that is definitely going to be, I don't see it stabilizing. I see it, if anything, from this work describing it getting more tumultuous moving forward and continue to split, move forward. So the second project that we looked at for the long-term effect was Ethereum's long-term impact. Ethereum is a little bit different than Bitcoin, because Ethereum, this described a little bit this global ledger of transactions that Bitcoin kind of was created around. Is Ethereum decided to do something a little bit more unique with it. They decided to put computing processing power on the back of these transactions. So in a way, what they did is all of this decentralized network, there's all these computers that have all this information, that in these processes that they're doing, they kind of turned it into a computing power, a computer, so that it could solve equations to run software. So just even the Zoom account, that runs your computer, centralized computer on your hard drive, your motherboard, the computer that you bought to even run this webinar. That's one computer, and it kind of chugs away and processes, so it's showing the video. Ethereum, the geniuses over at Ethereum figured out how to put that same kind of computing power in the piggyback on the back of this blockchain technology. And so that allows them to create programs like wallets and apps and smart contracts is what they're called. And so it allows people to do a lot more interesting things with cryptocurrency than Bitcoin ever could. And so a lot of people think it's kind of the future, and it's worth a lot less, although it also has exploded. I think it's up to $1,500 now. It was just a couple months ago, it was down at $200. So if you had Ethereum, you're probably doing pretty well right now. Anyway, our long-term impact for Ethereum on this project, I'm going to jump down to, again, so I have a lot of diagrams coming through, but I'm going to jump to the site template because that's the best place to describe what's in the data, because it's a little bit more clean. So I want to describe here diagrammatically what's going on. In the top left, this is describing Ethereum, long-term impact. And then we've got a lot of information around Ethereum about the why this information came in. So first, where this shows Ethereum. Now, please take note. This is not investment advice, please. Do your own research on whether or not this is not investment advice about Bitcoin or Ethereum or anything. This is just simply, we decided to look at it because it's so much part of our culture now. And a lot of people are really interested in this. And so why not look at it with remote viewing and see, look at it through that lens. Over here we have Ethereum. And this was just really diagrammatically in this session, it was drawn as basically a tower. And that this is a pinnacle achievement, a monument for currency takeover. And that it's something, a long-term impact of Ethereum is that it becomes a central hub and an architecture that's outsourced. So outsourced is essentially what the blockchain is. It's like this decentralized thing that essentially takes over currency. So, but what comes in, interestingly, with the work on the long-term impact of Ethereum is that we get a little bit of the why this becomes a pinnacle and why that this does actually really well. And it shows two different events here. Well, I believe they're connected, but two different diagrams of why this occurs. The first, it shows, here's just a bunch of diagrammatic life forms, just like circles. It's typically what they show in my shorthand when drawing them. These are investors. And it shows that there's a failure. There's a flash fleeing, a removing, leaving, exiting. People are in panic, and they're transiting over to Ethereum. And so something is going on somewhere else that is causing investors to completely freak out. And what is going on is what this is showing diagrammatically down here. Is that here I have, what this is a diagram of is Asia. This is the globe, essentially, a very, very basic shorthand of the globe. Here's over Asia, here's Japan, here's China right here. And I have a have like a line coming from 1 over to the US. Here's the United States over here, Alaska, Canada, US. And it shows that by design, there is an information data exchange that goes into a crash and a free fall. And this is going to cause a substantial amount of panic in a specific market. And this is not done by chance, as that this is actually done by design. In that it's done in a way, who's doing it is that there's a foreign threat with malicious intent that enacts something that's in a nefarious way of like a kill switch. And so whether we now, our postulate is that something is going to be done in cryptocurrency that is going to likely affect Bitcoin and potentially all the altcoins, that's going to cause a free fall. And which is why it would make sense that our long-term impact of Bitcoin is very tumultuous, that lines are drawn in the sand is what our work showed with Bitcoin, and that there's actually some of the work, if you look at it closely, it showed that there was a freeze of Bitcoin. And but Ethereum, it shows is that it shows investors actually fleeing to Ethereum. And just as kind of a full transparency, I actually don't own Ethereum. So I'm not trying to get anyone to buy Ethereum or Bitcoin here. Again, I kind of wish I was set up to buy a substantial amount of it a couple months ago, but based on this information that we ran in June, but I really have nothing to profit from this, but just for full transparency. Anyway, but it shows that there's a kill switch that's going to be enacted somewhere in this. And that's going to cause a huge panic, and people are going to switch over to Ethereum. Ethereum is one of the cryptocurrencies that is attempting to work with different government agencies. It's attempting to work with businesses. And it can do a whole lot more. It has a lot of issues with it still, as far as being able to expand. But at the same time, it doesn't have the kind of anti-government culture that a lot of Bitcoin has. And it's, I don't know, we'll kind of see what the future holds, but I really should turn my phone off. Sorry about that, guys. But it definitely seems that there's an event in the long term from when we ran this that is going to cause people to shift over to Ethereum as a central hub, as a monument or a pinnacle achievement that would turn into a currency takeover. This may also, again, more work is definitely going to be done on cryptocurrency, as well as this upsetting global markets that showed up in the data. What is this more specifically? Is it just cryptocurrency, or is it something a little bit larger? Obviously, if the US dollar completely crashed, where are people going to go? Or if there's an upset in the market. So we'll kind of see. But the interesting part about this is that it's a foreign threat that enacts this, is that it's a foreign agency that engages by some sort of variable by design that allows this upset to occur that causes this panic. So my final kind of caveat I do want to mention, though, with this work is that this is predictive work. This is work that attempts to use remote viewing to look into the future. And it's trying to see what is coming down the road. It's predictive remote viewing work is not necessarily 100%. It's a kind of thing where when we have a lot of remote viewers that are remote viewing the identical scenario, which in this case, there's a lot of other session work that came back identical to this work, is typically we feel very, very confident about that it's going to come about. But even then, I mean, it's a kind of thing. Here's the analogy I like to use for predictive remote viewing work. Is it's something where I believe it's almost like percentage based. And when you're asking to go into this library for information about something that hasn't happened yet, the information you get back is you're going to get the most probable outcome. And this is just a theory at this point. I don't have evidence necessarily to support one way or another, because I've seen it work really, really well, and I've also seen it fail. And so you can think of it as if you're trying to predict, let's say, metaphorically, what is someone going to have for dinner tonight? And you know that you're going to go to the store to go buy that dinner. But if the store has 75% tomato soup, all their shelves are tomato soup, then there's a fairly high chance that you're going to have tomato soup tonight. It's a fairly high probability that that's going to happen. But that other 25% is still there, whether that's vegetable soup, or maybe it's I don't know what kind of store this is, but it's maybe it's a soup store, but it's the kind of thing where it seems to us that if a lot of viewers very succinctly describe something, that it has a high probable chance of occurring. And that's just the best thing we can do to kind of describe about predictive events. It's good enough and it's fascinating enough to us to at least share the data that we have that comes back that's really, really succinct and kind of specific and describes what's going to come down the road. As an example, we did one, a number of this was in the beginning of 2016. This was back when I was running the State of Reality website, which was we were writing articles on remote viewing. And in March, we published an article on the next president before the 2014 or the 2016 presidential elections. This is even before the primaries had concluded. And all of our work came back. I mean, even one of the viewers described Trump as winning the election. And I think we looked at the betting websites back then. And it was like 1%. It's like 1 in 100 odds or something like that of Trump winning. It was like, we couldn't even believe the data. And so kind of as the months went by and, he won the primary, he was in the general election. And then even then it's like, election night, he's like a 1% chance to win. We're still like, is our data going to actually be right? And ultimately it was shown right that, it was a very large example, a large event that almost 10 months prior to it occurring, all the viewers very succinctly described the character of Trump and actually even named him. And so I've seen it work elegantly, but I've also seen it fail, where those have predicted some things such as different catastrophes or different things that would happen in the stock market that never really came about, even though good remote viewing data supported it. So I always recommend anyone who's kind of showing predictive remote viewing work, to take it with a grain of salt, that what you're probably looking at, if it's good remote viewing work, and it was done by those who are following the protocols, who are following the structure, and have corroborating viewers to kind of back up one viewer. What you're probably getting is a probable outcome, not necessarily a 100% outcome. At least that's my best theory at the moment, based on my experience with remote viewing. So I'm going to keep going here. I want to talk a little bit. I'm going to move on to the next project. I'm not actually sure in this webinar I'm going to have time to really do justice to the artifact project. I'm going to show probably a couple of the sketches for the artifact, and maybe I'll leave that kind of as a teaser for the next webinar I do, or upcoming videos, just because this is going on, taking me some time. I suppose once I get into stream of consciousness, I can go a little bit long describing some stuff, and I want to leave time for a Q&A too. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the Nazca Mummy next, show a little bit of the work that was actually done and how that evolved. And then from there, I'm going to open it up to a Q&A after I kind of show a couple of these sketches that were done on this artifact. And I'll leave that perhaps to next time. All right. So if you're not familiar with some of the work that I did along with a couple other viewers on the Nazca Mummy, switch over here. Target reference material for the Nazca Mummy. This is the Nazca Mummy, and this is a mummy that was found in Peru that, if you look at the picture a little bit closely, it's very, very strange. It's a very, very strange mummy. It has 3 fingers on both hands. These fingers are absolutely much longer than human fingers, from the base of the palm all the way to the tip of the fingers. Even if you were to do some sort of weird mutilation on hand, just from the base of the palm, the tip of the fingers, it's like 24 centimeters, I think, or something like that. So it's very, very strange. And even the toe is very strange. It has this giant head, interesting eyes, but this was during the summer of this past year. This was blowing up on social media. And it was Gaia TV, which is an online, I guess they create kind of original content on consciousness, on meditation, on conspiracy stuff. It was this topic. They were doing a series on the Nazca mummy, and which was kind of becoming really, a lot of people on social media were reacting like, whoa, what is this? And then at the same time, a lot of people looked at this photograph and the videos of it and like, that looks so incredibly fake. I don't even, like, how can anyone believe this? And so when we saw this, we kind of took a look at this and we're like, I don't know. There's some things about this that don't make sense, but why don't we look at it with remote viewing? Because, you want to talk about the number one thing that can pull back the kind of uncover the truth behind something that's happened in the past. It's certainly remote viewing, at least from our experience, is event recreation. Understanding what happened in the past is something that you can do with, if you know how to do the protocol, you know how to do the structure, you can do very, very easily. And especially when you're working with a team and with a project, is that you can describe some pretty cool stuff and event recreate a lot of really interesting events to understand what happened in the past. It doesn't have the same problems when you're trying to create events and describe things that happen in the future. So we decided to take a look at this one. And so those are the numbers that we used for the project. Those were the numbers that were given to the viewers. And those were even the numbers that I used. I was blind when I ran this target as well before we started doing follow-on work. And so this is what we hit. This is how we set up just a photo. We just use this photo. What is this? These numbers are associated with this. Go, remote view it. And so I'm going to show you the first session that came out. And the first remote viewing session here, very similar again to the stuff I've shown you before. I start with ideograms. Here's the number that I connect to the signal pattern to then start describing it. This is much more recent though. This is 6/29/2017. My handwriting hasn't gotten better, has it, over the years? It's gotten, but a lot of it's about speed. I've been doing this for, close to 10 years now. And so speed is something that I really, this is unnecessary for me to go back and be able to read later on. Don't really need to go into archetypes here. But I'm going to get down to the site template for everybody. And we're going to discuss the very first session that came out about what this project showed. And again, remember, this is completely blind. I had no idea what this target was. And so I'm describing something. I'm describing what this thing is. So the task that my unconscious or my higher mind, whatever part of me that's able to go to the library and kind of pull the book off the shelf and say, what's here? This is essentially went to whatever this thing is, describe it. Go to that book and then describe what's there. And that's what the site template does. So there's a couple things. The very first thing that came out at the beginning, before I get into the top part, is it describes, again, this is diagrams, very, very simple diagrams. It's not looking for high-level detailed sketches at this point. The first one is describing something that's rancorous. It's a preserved meat, biological, like something amniotic here. I have quiet again. I have this interesting word ahead here. This is a historical find. It's organic material. It's surrounded in a plastic exterior or encasement that's preserved. It's preserving whatever this meat is. So again, I don't have a person here. I also don't have anything here that's really describing fakery or something that's like a cast mold. I do have preserved, like an organic historical find that's been preserved, but I don't have anything here of like chicken bones that have been like used to fake. If there's something that occurs in remote viewing where if you try and mask something at a site or with a target, and they found this very early on in the research. This is actually one of the things that actually propelled the physicists that were working on developing remote viewing protocols and trying to figure out a teachable technique. What they learned is that the harder you try and hide something to a remote viewer, the greater it stands out in the remote viewing session. And they learned this when the CIA was tasked. This was back when the U.S. military was funding the research and development of these consciousness skills. Is that the CIA would give the researchers different practice targets, to evaluate how successful and whether their money was being well spent. And they gave them a target of a cabin in the woods of one of the individuals in the CIA. And you may have heard this story before, but kind of long story short is that right over the hill from where this cabin was, where the viewers were supposed to go and describe was this incredibly top secret NSA facility. And when the viewers started describing the cabin, they were like, this is like a boring site, but what's this? What's this thing over here? Oh, this must be what the target is, because surely this boring cabin must not be what they were having us look at. So what's this thing? And they went down and described all, showed up like a bright light bulb essentially to the viewers. And when they sent that report back up to the CIA, I mean, the entire intelligence apparatus and law enforcement agencies of the entire United States descended upon the research lab at the Stanford Research Institute, saying, how did you get this information? Who's leaking you these details? And there was I think it was like a 5-year investigation that was done until they were finally cleared. And once that happened, the CIA is like, okay, we can use this against the Russians. This is real. They've proven that this is a real phenomenon. Let's actually start using this actively for national security interests. And they did that all the way up until the early 90s. And so, but it was because that site was hidden. I mean, it's a top secret facility. The viewers were like, it was like just a big light bulb. And so one of the things that happens is in this work, one thing does actually show up that is interesting. And that is, where is it on the website? Or not, did I not write it? Not website, on the page. I don't think it's on this site template. Quiet. I think maybe it is having to do with quiet. Again, I have like 200 pages worth of work on this project. So sometimes my specific where a certain descriptor is or part, it gets mixed up. But anyway, there's nothing in here. Like if someone's faking something as well, it's the same kind of thing where it'll show up right away. It'll show like the people that are doing it. It'll show the intentions behind it, trying to trick. Like a lot of the type of photographs that I've done that looked at UFOs come back that way, where it doesn't even go to the site. It just goes to someone sitting at a computer screen and creating a hoax, or it just was like trickery, some like person who's trying to make money off some other people, stuff like that. But none of that existed in this original site template. What existed here was a historical find that was preserved in this plastic exterior encasement, and that there's like this really rancorous smell that's associated with it. I'll get into this data down here in a minute, this Android inserted place future descendants thing, because we explored that. But the other information that I got in this session about the base work was, again, it was a diagram of, it was a compact place. And I believe this is probably where they found the body, because this is it shows an opening here and then like on a ceiling at a bottom. And then here's a body. Here's the body itself, the preserved mummy. And here's another kind of, for context, if you will, and on the site template, here's a body and there's a bunch of other ones in here as well. And so in this, we did more work to describe this, but the short narrative here of what's going on is we got information that this is punishment and exile that was associated with this thing, this body. And that it was put in this place, this compact, collapsed ceiling. It was murdered, exiled. There's this whole story that we kind of had to look into, that we got just a piece of here, about it had to do with crossbreeding. It had to do with love for a human, broken rules, punishment, and regret, and they kind of put in these close quarters and compact place. And that there's a bunch of these things here. And so we looked at a couple of things. So I'll move forward. So, but the first thing that we realized is that nothing in this work showed hoax from the first session. Nothing. And so that kind of took us aback. We're like, whoa, okay, well, what are we dealing with here? Is this real? Well, let's do more work. So what we ended up doing is we took this and we decided to do a death recreation event. So obviously if something's faked, if this thing is made out of chicken bones and this thing was plastered together by Hollywood special effects artists or whatever, you're not going to get a death event because it never was alive. Or if it was like a human corpse, maybe you might get something else. But you still, it shouldn't be cohesive. So the death event for this, and there's a lot of data here, so I'm just going to kind of try and, this is a diagram. It shows a person here, so I'll zoom in here. If this is circles are very simple diagrams for people. A person here's like, imagine here's two legs sitting in like this tub, this big iron kind of tub. And there are toxic chemicals that are gushing down like a canopy from all these different other life forms up above. And they're kind of like down in this pit, they're filling this kind of crevice with these toxic chemicals, and they're raining down like a canopy on top of this thing. It's filling up this tub. And it shows condensing this paste or pitch, a tar liquid, a batter that is going down, it's kind of raining down on this person. And have just a lot of the centrifugal forces here, the chemicals. I get a lot of the heat, where it's like a fire char draped over. But then who's doing it is this person's betters, their peers, their associates are doing this, as they're there's like an acid bath that results in a flat line for this individual. And but they're doing it because these people are the law. Is the people that are doing this is a punishment for this person. This person has done something to break the law. And so we have data about someone who's like drying, roasting, being cooked alive. I mean, it's really not a pleasant way to go for this individual. This is the emotion. The EI stands for an emotional impact that we can pick up when we're doing remote viewing work. And one of the viewers that we contracted out, because the times what I'll do is for large projects, I'll pay other good remote viewers to do work for me to get corroborating data. I have a team that works. We work together. We do work back and forth. But sometimes I'll hire other remote viewers out there to do work for me, and they very much connected. And I felt a little bit bad afterwards because she actually was connected a little bit closely to the emotions that went on at the death event of the site. And it's really not a place you want to connect with emotionally, because it was very traumatic for this individual, for this life form, the death event for this life form, going back to the Nazca mummy. So again, the death event, if this was just a Hollywood hoax, we would not get such a very succinct, and this was corroborated by other remote viewing work. So this is when I know that I can trust this work. And I know I can trust the work because I do calibration targets very consistently. But at the same time, other work independent of mine described the same kind of an event of someone basically being tarred in a tub. And it was the law. It was the superiors in that society that was doing it as a punishment. And we kind of looked at, though, that something was being hushed. There's a descriptor, quiet. Something was being hushed or kept quiet about this target. And that's when we sent this work out we sent it out to Gaia. We sent out kind of a package saying, hey, you might find this interesting. We sent it out to a couple other sources once we kind of finished it. And but what was being hushed, what came back out of this remote viewing work, this is what ended up getting such significant kind of interest in the work, was because what happened is we started describing something that was not even released yet publicly about the Nazca mummy, which is that the hushed associated with this mummy in this work. So I have a diagram of just, it's very, very, very simple, of just a body, 2 arms, a leg, a head on a table. And then there's this cross section here. I had AOL that in the session because it was too high level. And then I describe that there is something is hushed that is a shell of evidence that's being kept quiet. Where's the actual, here it is. Here's a larger drawing of it. Again, very diagrammatic. Here's the body, and here's the line across. And the data that came through was pregnant, is that this particular life form was pregnant. And then what's being kept quiet, what's being kept hushed about it, right when I ran the session, why that came through, was that there was a womb that was excised. And then the cavity, what this line is right across the belly of this thing, is that there was a baby that was taken out of this life form. And this was long before, if you're familiar with the story or you're familiar with the web series on the Nazca mummy, that none of the information, there actually was, if I can go down to, we did some some detailed sketches at the time. So right here is a picture at the bottom showing the actual fetus that was actually found at the same location as this mummy. And we haven't really gotten a whole lot of information even to this day, I think, on this particular thing. But this was before any information had even come out from Gaia. And so we had the producers of Gaia come to us and be like, how could you know this information? And first they kind of wanted to see what we had, but then basically said, well, yep, we haven't released any information about this yet, but you're certainly on track. And if you listen to the Jimmy Church radio show, we're invited to speak on that because he knows, Jimmy Church knows, it's Jay Widener. He called Jay and he's like, did these guys send you information about this before you even released it? How could they have known? He's like, yep, no, they actually did. And so it was a pretty fun radio show with Jimmy Church, kind of talking about the work, the history, what we did, as well as the story of this mummy and kind of its tragic end, and how remote viewing was able to kind of unpack what happened with this specific mummy. But we were able to kind of get the scoop on this story before, just because they were essentially, what Gaia was doing is they were withholding this information because I'm sure they had like a release date and a way of like doing the narrative. They're waiting to hold this information back, and it showed up in the original work that was being kept quiet, that was being kept hushed. And so that's how we ended up picking up on it. The final thing about the Nazca mummy, though, and this is probably the most strange, the most outlandish, not that the mummy itself isn't very strange to begin with, but we had descriptor. If you remember, I'm going to go back. There's this data here, like when we put two tick marks around it, it's using like quotes. And so it's like, it's not exactly this, but it's like this because it's the closest thing I have in my vocabulary. And I said that it's like an android. It's like this thing isn't really alive. It's like an android. And an android in my vocabulary, it's like something that walks around, it's got a computer chip in it. And a computer chip, it's not the body, it's not the mechanical body that's using to move it around, it's the chip, more likely. That's where the intelligence is. And that there's this android-like thing that was inserted and placed into this biological thing that made it go. At least this was the original analysis. But this made no sense to us because we're like, wait a minute, android, biological meat, this makes no sense. Let's take a look at it. So we made it a project and we kind of explored it. I'm going to show you some of that work and also what data came back about it. So the first drawing of what this was, showed kind of like, I don't know, I actually prefer to kind of go to the very end. So we described something essentially this is where it goes a little bit esoteric, perhaps, maybe too esoteric for some people, but that there's a crystalline entity that actually is attached near the thorax. So actually, if I go up to the stage 4 here, and I look at the high-level data that we got that's associated with the android, is that there's something that is interior, that's shielded from harm, so it has a casing, that's a device that shields it from harm, and it's attached to the thorax near the throat. And this thing here is like a brain or an operating system for this thing. And there's a shiny shield, but it's like a jewel, like a crown, glowing, shimmering circumference. So something near the thorax of this mummy existed that was like a brain that operated this body similar to like an operating system runs your computer. And that it exists in this high-level drawing. I put it around the throat. That was kind of the closest diagrammatic drawing I could kind of do with it. That essentially it's like a crystalline entity that's running this thing. But it's not any kind of crystalline entity. This is a rebellious, compassionate, kind entity, but that it's gone. It's no longer. It doesn't exist anymore. So, in fact, what this thing is, though, it's like a cosmos of thought inside this little object. So I ended up doing like a drawing of it. This is just an artistic rendering of what maybe I thought something like that could look like. It was just like a crystal maybe that was around the throat or around the thorax. Interestingly, what was found, this is a X-ray of one of the other bodies found at the site. And this is another reason why the producers at Gaia got back to us, not only because we're describing information they hadn't released yet, which was about the baby, but also we were describing that there's some sort of device, some sort of crystalline device that should be or would have been near the thorax or throat of this mummy. And other mummies that were found there actually were found to have something right where we said would exist, right on the throat, which is what now again, like a lot of the information here hasn't really come out about what these things are from Gaia. It's like they've said, oh, we don't know what these are. They're like these metal plates that have been fastened around the thorax area of these tiny mummies. Our work showed, though, that the big mummy, that it wasn't there anymore, that it was destroyed. Our postulates is that when they killed that individual mummy, that it wasn't a mummy at that point, right? When they killed that specific life form, that they destroyed that device that was connected to its body, and that in destroying that's actually what destroyed its mind. Because if this thing is like if it was like an android, it may have had a gray matter, but it wasn't the gray matter in its head wasn't the thing that was controlling the operation of its body. It was this thing that existed right here, that was a cosmos of thought, that it was like allowing it to have an experience in 3D reality by moving around with that body. So it was almost like an avatar of sorts. And so it was found on the other bodies right where we said it would, based on the remote viewing work, were these devices. I mean, all they've been able to tell so far that I'm aware of is that there's it's a very strange metal that's right around the chest area, the upper chest thorax area of these bodies. And they don't know what it is. And it's like, well, according to our work, that's what these things, that's the mind of these actual things, is that the bodies themselves are not necessarily, I'm sure we could take the work and we could look at the origin of the actual organic body that was taken from this and see how it came to be. Was it born? Was it created and somehow artificially? But I believe we probably would come back with something that's a little bit odd or different from what we would expect. Some of their later work came back that the DNA of the big mummy, of the fingers and of the mummy itself, was the same. That was one of the big controversies, or skeptics claim, well, it's like, those are just chicken bones that someone shoved into some dead human that died in the 1600s or something like that, and they faked it and they put plaster around it. But they found that it had the exact same dating, from the fingers, those long fingers, to the skull, to the rest of the body. It was all the same date. And that the other thing that came back, though, was that the DNA was very, very similar to human, if not, it was 99% human DNA in that body. And it makes sense to me based off this work, because the story that we remote viewed about the punishment and the death of this life form, why it was killed by its peers in its society, was because it was mating with humans, was because it was interacting and essentially, if you go back to the original work, this is one of the original ones, is this thing has eggs. Is that reproduction seems to be a key thing here, key theme here with these mummies. So the small ones have eggs, and yet they're here in this place where these bodies and these mummies were exiled. And this is a type of a punishment where they were put in this plaster and set to be an example for a long period of time. And then here's the other one. The other body was found, and then there's a fetus that was found right alongside of it. And it's our belief, based on the remote viewing work, that society had rules in place that it should not, that individuals of that society, for whatever reason, however they worked, that they should not crossbreed with humans. And that in doing so, it was breaking just a massive rule of society. And it was like the ultimate law never to do, and that they were doing this in secret and yet found out and then punished. And so, but to be able to crossbreed with humans, I mean, apes are like, what, 98% same human DNA, and you can't crossbreed apes with humans or chimpanzees with humans. And so to be able to crossbreed, you'd have to be almost identical to human DNA, like maybe tiny, tiny little differences, which is the type of information they really haven't released yet. But it makes sense, because that's the story we got with remote viewing. And so all the people that were really hoping that, this is going to be something that's like only 50% human DNA, I never really anticipated based off the remote viewing work. And so it was definitely a very fascinating story. One of the things that we kind of left, that we did a little bit more work on, was about what existed down in the underground area, and how some of the work, we believe that some of these devices right here may not necessarily have been completely deactivated, and that it's actually that place is a kind of a prison cell for whatever these things are. Some of them were destroyed. I believe the main one, the Nazca mummy, the large body, they didn't even find it on the body. Just like it's no more, according to the remote viewing work. But it's almost like a penitentiary for these things. And whether or not I would suggest anyone wanting to go down into there, I would not necessarily recommend that, because who knows? I'd have to do a lot more work to see what the long-term impact or the effect of kind of going down deep into that underground area. But it kind of also ties into another topic with remote viewing. And I'm really not going to have time to get to the artifact tonight, so it's going to have to be another night. I do want to, but there's a phenomenon that exists with remote viewing at a level where when you are looking at certain topics, and this is almost like the flip side of the argument of the ethical implications. If you teach someone how to do this, and they use it to kind of uncover someone's uppermost thoughts or their deepest secrets or something that someone might be doing to find dirt on somebody. Apparently that was actually happening. It's one of the reasons why a couple people left the military program in the late 80s, was because senators apparently were being briefed about this remote viewing military unit. And they were coming to the remote viewing unit for what one of the individuals referred to as psychic hand jobs, because they wanted to know about, were they going to win their next election? What kind of dirt can I get on can you look at my opposition and see if you can get on something that will help me win? And not using the unit in that way, in which, that's a really horrible way to use it, especially a taxpayer funded unit, right? Like that's a little absurd. And so it's a kind of thing where, hold on one sec. This just went down. There we go. It's the kind of thing is that ethical implications that someone who takes this to the advanced level and is able to become proficient more than just looking at photographs is like, if you kind of give these tools to someone that are going to use it unethically, are you then responsible then as a teacher for their actions? I don't have an answer for that question right now. And for the most advanced training I ever do, I always make sure that, I have long, a lot of communication with the individual, and that they're not someone who's necessarily going to use this in a way that's to harm other people. I am familiar with other teachers, even those from the remote viewing program, that came out of the military and taught people that didn't really have a very high bar, or maybe they had no bar about ethics, about what they were teaching. And they said, I just don't teach ethics. And they ended up teaching a lot of really unsavory individuals. If I can prevent it, if I can help it, I'm going to try to avoid doing that. But just, at the basic level, if you're just, interested in hitting, photographs, it's not really something to worry about. It's only when you start taking it to the advanced level that you kind of run into those ethical implications. But alternatively, something else happens, is that, say someone has the best intentions, and say someone decides to learn remote viewing to the most advanced level, is that it's a very rare occurrence, but it's happened to me a couple times. It's happened to a couple other viewers a couple times, is that when you look at something with remote viewing, the assumption, the theory going into it has been, this is just a database of information. It's just patterns in a library. You're pulling back, and you're just describing, tell me what you see. What am I hearing spontaneously? What thoughts are catching? I'm writing it down, drawing it archetypically on the page. There are instances and where it's not necessarily just a one-way street, where it seems that certain types of targets have the ability, and these are other life forms, people or life forms, have the ability to know when you're looking at their pattern of information. Like they put, like there's a little, our theory is that maybe there's an ability in consciousness to put a little alarm bell on your book. And then if anyone goes, checks out your book and takes it home to read it, you get a little email that says, hey, someone's looking at your book, by the way. And then, in which case, if someone has the ability to do that, then they have the ability to then also use consciousness tools to look at you. And if you use this skill, to look at some of these targets that have those alarm bells on them. In session and out of session, you can have experiences where these things are looking back at you because they're just curious about what's looking at them. And that has created experiences for people in the past that are very, very unnerving for them. And so, and even for me, I'll give you an example. I've only really told a couple of people about, those that I've worked with, is that when I was originally training with one of the military members, the advanced level of training, they gave me a target that was something that they had been looking at for a number of years, dating all the way back into the military program when the U.S. Navy was launching, what was it? It was the intercontinental ballistic missiles. I forget what those are called now. It's escaping my mind. But it was the first time that the U.S. was developing those. And every time that they were developing these rockets and launching them, trying to test to see if they worked, a little dot of light would they track it with the camera. A little dot of light would come from off screen, start tracking alongside the missile. A beam of light would zap the missile. The little orb would zoom around to the other side. Another beam of light would zap the missile, and then the light would disappear, and then the missile would crash into the ocean. It would stop working. And so the Navy went to the RV program and was trying to figure out, okay, what in the world is this thing? We've tried everything. We've exhausted all of our resources to understand what this is. What can you tell us what it is? And so they came to the military unit to help hopefully kind of understand what this was. And the work showed that this was not Russians. Russians were not doing this. It was not some other human agency. This was an agency doing this that was not from around here. And they were doing this in a way that was very, very clandestine. And they were able to describe the location they were doing this from. And that when, they had to go and brief the Navy on this, the Navy was like, oh, okay, well, great. Probably necessarily didn't believe it. But when you have agencies that are not from around here kind of interacting in the affairs of U.S. governments. But anyway, in my training with this individual, he gave me the target of their location now, of those that were kind of doing that, to go to and describe and remote view the location of the group that was operating here back then. This was in the 70s, I think, is when those missiles were being tested, is to go there in present time and describe the location. And so, at the time, I didn't know that. I was just given a set of numbers. And as I was running the session, I was describing an underground facility, a domed underground facility with a very large advanced computer system in the center of this domed facility. And there were 3 life forms around it, working on it. And the life forms, though, once I got to the session, in the sessions, so I'll go back up here. Once we get to stage 4, stage 4 is when we finally are able to we've done enough work, time on target is what we call it. And I'm finally able to get to a point where I can get high-level ideas, whether it's life forms, the emotions of the life forms, the activities of what they're doing. In the stage 4s, when I put my pen, it's almost like a directed process. When I put my pen under the emotions of the life forms, something very strange happened. What occurred is, instead of just getting what I normally expected to get, was just emotional data, because it's almost like a prompt. I put my pen under that column and I say, okay, I'm listening to the spontaneous data that arises in this avenue. What emotions are present at the site? And then usually I'll get, well, they're busy or studious or whatever it is, right? Instead of that happening automatically, what ended up happening, the spontaneous thoughts I was catching in the session, in the structured session, were not emotions. They were stop. What are you doing? These are the words that were coming through spontaneously that I was hearing. Stop. What are you doing? Oh my God, stop. And I remember, because this was in a monitored session, and so my teacher was showing me, essentially, it was like watching me do the work. And I kind of was pausing, and he was like, okay, what's going on? What's wrong? And I'm trying to write, and I'm telling him, I don't know where to write these words in the structure, because they're out of place. And it was very, very strange. And I was getting data coming back that something about these individuals, about these life forms, was able to tell that I was remote viewing them in present time. And that I was picking up data in real time in the stage 4 about their emotional state, of them noticing me look at their file of information, of their pattern. And they were freaking out about it. And they were sending information back to me saying, stop, what are you doing? And it kind of unnerved me for a little bit for a couple of days after that. Nothing happened after that. But, just the fact that, I'm on the radar of something like this that I didn't necessarily sign up for. And, it's happened maybe 5 or 6 more times in my remote viewing career where I've looked at something and there's been varying degrees of it looking back. And so if you give advanced remote viewing toolkit to someone who is not necessarily diligent about what they decide to look at, they decide to look at a whole lot of stuff that may or may not have a negative effect looking back at them. Because there's it's my firm belief that there's a number of proficient viewers out there, and it can happen to those who maybe aren't necessarily aware of it. But I think that if you kind of engage with a lot of different topics and targets where you're dealing with entities, or you're dealing with aliens, or a lot of these types of stuff, I think it's fine to remote view a lot of type of stuff, and I have. But I think if you're not careful about what you look at, you're not careful about the type of protection that you set up, this is not a one-way street with a lot of this type of stuff. And so if you don't go into it with that knowledge, with that understanding that you need to be smart and protected about what you're doing, then you might be opening a door and putting a light on your back to bring attention to yourself that you might not want in your life. And so, maybe in another webinar, another video, I'll go into and I'll talk a little bit about, not tonight because I really just don't have time because I want to get to a Q&A here. There's been a couple of other instances in my life where I was looking at stuff with other viewers, non-terrestrial related, that is blown up pretty substantially now in, I suppose, conspiracy circles that I was looking at with a team. And as I was doing this, stuff was physically showing up in my reality, kind of in my day-to-day life. I was having lights fly through my room. I was having all types of stuff happen. That was very, very unnerving. I was not prepared to handle that. And so it's a kind of thing where it's like remote viewing in a way it's kind of like a hot stone. And it's like if you hand it to somebody that's not ready for it or hasn't, they're going to burn themselves. Or it's like fire maybe is better than a hot stone, is that they're going to get burned themselves. And that only really happens at an advanced level. You really have to take it to an advanced level, I think, for, and have to be a little bit naive about what you're looking at to kind of be affected or burned in that way. If you're just starting remote viewing, doing photo targets, basic stuff like that, there's really you're just looking at a photograph. I've never heard of any negative experiences from that. But at the same time, the flame works inversely, because if you give someone the skill, that flame, you can use that flame to also burn a village down. You can use this information to cause havoc and run amok in someone else's life. Look at their uppermost thoughts. Look at their deepest secrets. Look at ways to kind of undermine someone else's endeavor or activity or anything like that. So it's almost like, how do you then go about bringing remote viewing to a larger audience? And I think it can be done. And it's my hope, with kind of technical intuition, with stories from the Matrix, with the new YouTube videos that I'm going to be doing, with sharing kind of like the inner mechanisms of how structured remote viewing works with people, so that those that find it fascinating and interesting maybe, attempt to develop it themselves. Or if not, it's just they can be part of a community that finds it fascinating and can have a discussion about it. Because there's definitely smarter minds out there than mine that should probably one day have a discussion about ethics about some of this stuff and about how it should be used, not about necessarily about how it can be used. But that's kind of the inverse, the kind of the other side of where remote viewing can go. So anyway, that's the end of the Nazca Mummy, the work I wanted to show off tonight. The last one, which is, I guess I'll leave it as a kind of a teaser before I open up the Q&A, is the North America most significant presently undiscovered artifact. It's something, I guess I just need to do a whole webinar on it, or a whole series of videos, because there's over 2 years worth of remote viewing work here. But I want to show you one drawing. So I won't go into too much of it. I just didn't have the time. But this thing right here is underground, and that's the artifact. And there's a whole lot more that's associated with it. This thing is incredibly old. It's in North America. And it's an underground complex that has some very, very interesting technology inside of it that's not from modern day humans. So we've looked into, I was naive to think that this was something that, could be brought back, put in the Smithsonian and be like, hey, this is something that remote viewing found. Isn't this unique? Hey, go try remote viewing yourself. It's a cool process. I was a little naive because the information that came back is that this is a whole complex. And there's a lot of very, very fascinating devices that exist here, the purpose behind this, the builders of this, what it does. And we've looked at this from every angle. And so I kind of want to, I want to start sharing some of this information because it's just so fascinating. And then, in the next couple of years, it's my hope that, we actually we know where this is. We've done a lot of work to do geographical location work to describe surrounding areas, a lot of other stuff that we've done to kind of figure out where this is at. And I want to, at some point, actually go there and see if we can actually, get some ground truth. It's one thing to do remote viewing work and describe it and have an artistic rendering of what the work shows. It's another thing to actually go to a place that kind of predates human civilization and uncover it and bring it to the world. So, that's something that's a long-term goal of mine, I suppose. We'll get there when we get there, but in the webinar, I guess what I'll have to do is I'll do a little bit more extensive project going over all these results because it's very, very fascinating. And maybe this little teaser will, you guys will come back and you'll join me for that stories from the Matrix. So that's it for me on the work. What I'm going to do now is I will, let's see here. Let me go full screen again. If anyone has a question, I'll do questions for a while here. Thank you guys I'm going a little bit over in time here. So thanks for joining me tonight and just letting me share with you guys some of the remote viewing work, just some of the discussions that I think are relevant to the topic and some of the projects. And this is fun to do. I think doing videos like this on YouTube are going to be fun. I think ultimately creating a community around technical intuition and stories from the Matrix, and then remote viewing that kind of is more inclusive to the different communities and groups, as opposed to something that's more dogmatic about this is the way you should do it and therefore everyone else is a heretic. I think would be more beneficial. Like, it's something that brings people together as opposed to divides, which I think when we're talking about consciousness communities is something that should exist. So we'll see how it goes, and but if you have questions, you can do, if you hit the Q&A, I think you can, if you can put it in chat, I'll go through chat, but there's also a Q&A. I think you can ask questions as well. So I'll go through one by one. The first one I have here, so type them and I'll do my best to answer them. The first one I have is from Diana here. And Diana asks, in your remote viewing episodes, have you ever had an experience where a dark interloper may have come into what you were viewing in a threatening way? This is actually what I was talking about, I suppose, at the end, kind of my anecdote about if someone's not ready when they're looking at things that they're not ready for, that it can open a doorway to something or a communication method with something that they're not ready to handle. And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. And it's, I don't want to go into details right now, maybe in a different video or maybe a different webinar setting. I'll go into some of the specifics because I'd like to talk a little bit about the project that kind of came off of it, that generated these type of results. Now, interestingly, it only happened, there were about 5 viewers. No, there were 4 viewers that were on the project, and I was the project manager. So I wasn't actually even doing the remote viewing work. I was the project manager, and all the other viewers were blind. And they didn't have any negative experiences in the session. All of the negative experiences that occurred afterward happened to me outside of the session. And I never really have gone back to look at why yet. I have some ideas, but I've basically, there was about a period of about 6 months where it was very uncertain for me and whether I was going to continue remote viewing because of the type of experiences it was generating. But I'll talk maybe a little bit more in those details. It was almost like a trial by fire for me is what it was. It was because I wasn't told by anyone when I was learning remote viewing that this kind of thing could happen and that you should be aware of it and that you should investigate. I'm someone who can teach remote viewing. I'm not someone who can teach someone because it's not my proficiency, it's not my skill set. I can't teach someone to protect themselves against this kind of thing. It's not what I'm skilled at. It's not what I'm, but I think that it's important to know that it's possible and that you should take precautions. Let me move this up. It's kind of down. Okay, there we go. So yeah, it can. It's not necessarily a one-way street. And so what you look at, I think you should be, as a remote viewer or any type of intuitive, even if you're using non-structured remote viewing techniques, I think you should be careful what you look at. If you're looking at dark stuff, anticipate that you might get looked back at by dark stuff. Now, that doesn't mean that's necessarily something that if someone is interested in looking at or understanding, I've certainly done my fair share to try and understand what's going on in reality, to not do it, but just to make sure you go into it with a type of protect yourself kind of a thing. So, hopefully that answers your question. Another question from Laura is, have you ever remote viewed a person's galactic soul origin? It's an interesting question. Now, the term galactic soul, we have to be careful of language because, what does that mean necessarily? Probably depends on who you ask. Maybe a galactic soul I'm not familiar with. Obviously, I'm familiar with soul. I have done a project with a number of other viewers that looked at the origin of modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens. We looked at where that split point, how that occurred and why, different than the soul. It was not natural. And it was, but as far as soul is concerned, there's a couple things that I have two answers to the question. The first answer to the question is you can look at past lives with actual remote viewing. There's a way of setting up the project that you can actually hone in on and describe a past life. And it happens, you can repeat this. And you can have multiple viewers independently view someone else's in a certain manner, and they'll come back with the same description. Usually describe a significant event in that life as like a context for what it was that the person did. It was a little interesting on one individual. We looked at their past life. And his past life, he was a remote viewer, and everyone came back with a stripper. It looked like a burlesque in like the 1800s or something like that. And so I was like, okay, it's a little odd, but this is what came back. So, origin of galactic soul, individual, no. Maybe you could figure out a way to do that, but that's the first answer to the question is you can do past life type of stuff. So I'm very, based on remote viewing work, I feel confident saying that. As far as the soul is concerned, is that it's much longer. This is not a beginning and an end in this life. I feel very confident, not even just on remote viewing stuff, but on kind of other work that I've done from meditation, astral projection type stuff, more experiential stuff. Because typically when I'm doing anything soul related or astral planes type stuff, at least that's a language that you might use to describe it, remote viewing is not the best tool to explain those types of things. It's better to a little bit more experience it. So I use different methods to kind of engage with that. The second answer to that question is I've also, with a group, we've looked at things like, and this is like, again, another webinar and another web series perhaps of videos that we've looked at. It's called, I think it's Moksha. I can't remember the exact name, but it's the cycle of death and rebirth. And we looked at that with remote viewing in depth, the purpose for it, why it exists, who created it, what it's doing, and as far as how, and whether or not those are souls in that, maybe in a different webinar or web series, I can talk about that project. It's a very, very fascinating project as well. So yes, I have. It's very fascinating, maybe not specifically galactic soul. I'm not sure what you mean by that, but it's definitely possible. And there's some interesting stories that in the future, I'll certainly be talking about. Erwin asks, let's see, thanks so much. Question, what is your take on the Farsight Advanced SRV? Also, is there any connection between out-of-body experiences, lucid dreaming, and remote viewing? Sure. I have a lot of respect for what Courtney's done with Farsight. He's done a lot to bring remote viewing to a larger audience with videos and, maybe a little bit unorthodox with some of the things that he's done. But, and he's definitely had a lot of hurdles that he's confronted with over the past. He's been doing it for far longer than me, all the way since the 90s. Obviously he's a lot older than me too. But it's, I think, I have nothing really negative to say about Farsight, and they're going to do what they're going to do. And I wish any remote viewer that's interested in bringing awareness towards whatever methodology that you're using out there, that that consciousness is much larger. That consciousness has the human capacity to understand reality in a way that we don't, say, in society use every day, except maybe on a gut level or intuition level. That you can actually apply it, you can control it, and you can access very specific information. If he's bringing awareness to that with his videos, I have a lot of, I'm grateful for that. I wish there was more people out there producing content that did that. It's a little bit different, his focus, than what I'm interested in focusing it on, and this also the way that he sets it up, which is fine. People have different styles and aesthetics, but SRV was a derivative, I believe, of which scientific remote viewing. I've gone over the structure. I'm familiar with it. I know it's a derivative of controlled remote viewing, and also a derivative of what he learned from Ed Dames with the Learn RV stuff. And I have never used it personally, but I know he's worked with a lot of really fantastic viewers out there, like Daz Smith is another person that he's worked with, who's a really great remote viewer, and a couple others. So, I wish him the best of luck, and I hope he continues finding success with it. The second part of connection with OBEs, lucid dreaming, and RV. I started lucid dreaming before I even got into remote viewing. And it's like practicing what's referred to as reality checks throughout your day, when you're counting your fingers throughout the day, so that you count your fingers in the dream. And what happens is you count your fingers in the dream and you have 27 fingers in the dream. And so it's like, oh, wait a minute, something's off. So it should let you know that you're dreaming, and you can then take control of the dream. I've never really used remote viewing practices in lucid dreaming. I think maybe the discipline of remote viewing, of needing to do reality checks, is maybe kind of similar to the discipline of RV, where you have to stick with it. But it's a little bit different. I'm not sure it's necessarily operating on the same plane or even with the same database. I think it's a little bit, even out of body projection, you can use with extended remote viewing. It's called ERV. You use techniques that the Monroe Institute developed, where you put yourself in an altered state of consciousness, and then you use your visualization techniques to send you to the site. And then you experience what's there, and you can describe it. And then once you kind of come out of it, it's almost like you go into like this sleep state, but you're still conscious. Your body's asleep, mind awake. And there's semi-structured remote viewing techniques that have been developed. That's referred to as ERV, which I'm proficient at. I use often, but I always come back to the more structured pen on paper techniques, because I'm able to get more technical data about that kind of comes out of the work, which lends itself to solving a problem a little bit better than just experiencing a site. It's like, ooh, what an interesting place, as opposed to, the structured techniques. I can get the purpose, I can get the function, I can jump off, I can go to where the origin of this place is. I can go into all these different ways very, very cleanly, which you can't really do as easily with the more free form. I guess it's really not free form, but structured out-of-body techniques. So hopefully that answers your question. There's definitely more to be said about this topic, and maybe I'll make videos about it and talk about it more in the future. Carrie, hi Carrie, asked the question, are you aware of Courtney Brown's team recently viewing the Phoenix Lights, where they were viewing cat beings inside a craft who were being viewed and they could communicate with them in real time and get answers to questions. Have you had two-way communication with a larger, not just getting to stop? Yes, actually I have. I have had an experience, interestingly, with the project that I decided that we just didn't have time. I guess I talked too much to really go over tonight, but I will talk about in the future, which is the artifact, the most significant presently undiscovered artifact in North America. Some of the technology that exists there, when you interact with it, in a way, what it does is it calls other beings to interact through the technology with you there. And these are things that are just far, far beyond us as far as consciousness is concerned. And it seems that some of where these things are located is actually deep in the earth, and that when you go to this place and you interact with some of the stuff that's there, is they actually come up from the center of the earth, and they stay there for a period of time interacting with those that are there at the site for a couple of different reasons. As I was remote viewing that blind, and I was describing these type of life forms, this type, I mean, I don't know if it's like a life form at this point. I suppose it is, but it's just like a type of consciousness. There was, I don't know if I would say two-way communication, because of the type of structured technique I use kind of doesn't necessarily allow for that. You might be able to do that in some more advanced stuff, but there was certainly a type of, there were sensations in stage 4 data where it was communicating information to me. And it was like, it was almost like a nonverbal, emotional type of stuff I was getting. And so it was very, very loving though. It was almost like I was getting in, it was as if you take the consciousness of something that's a Buddha or a Jesus or something that far beyond, and it's like this incredible love that kind of just this overwhelming love that just kind of came on me when I was running the remote viewing session, trying to describe this thing. And it was just palpable in the room. And kind of was picking up on the intent of trying to understand what this was, understand how it played a role, and how, it was just basically sending love. And it was a beautiful experience. I was really fortunate to kind of have that. And so I'd love to, it's one of the reasons why I also kind of continued work on that. It's not something that was, I love kind of pulling back the veneer to understand, what's going on, on the kind of the control side, the dark side, so to speak. But, it's also, it's really, I'm fortunate to be able to interact with things that are on the positive side as well. So, not necessarily communication. I don't know what techniques Courtney would have been using to communicate. If he was using something that used a monitor, so you had someone who was monitoring the session, and then the viewer who was actually doing the work, the monitor would be able to tell the individual, hey, do this, make certain movements in real time that the viewer themselves should never do. Because if you're thinking about the data that's coming in as a viewer, you are going to corrupt the stream of the stream pattern. You're going to corrupt it because you are thinking, you're using your conscious mind to determine what should be evaluated. And the whole structured process, the whole point of it is to get that conscious side, that imagination side, that ego side out of the way, and to purely let the unconscious be able to deliver the patterns of information through this form of thought catching, which is what I refer to it as. So, I've looked at my fair share of craft, and it's, I haven't had necessarily the most pleasant descriptions. I haven't had any negative interactions. Like really the back and forth type of thing with RV in my experience is very, very rare. It's very rare. It's typically a very one-way process where it's just pulling the book off the shelf, transcribing what's there, and then kind of moving on, ending the session, and then that's it. Nothing happens. So, obviously I can't speak specifically for Courtney, what occurred and what protocol, not to say protocols, but what methods he was using for that to work. But I wouldn't be surprised if something like that was possible. But most stuff in craft that I've looked at is not real pretty, and doesn't really have very good intentions for the most part. Let's see. Erwin asks, have you ever viewed source origin of your reality? Yes, I actually have. Done a long project. Before shifting, there was a large shift kind of before. What I was doing was associated with what's called Troika, the Troika group. And that shifted a little bit because a couple people moved on. And kind of stories from the Matrix, technical intuition is me kind of spearheading and pushing it forward as kind of the front. And I'm still working with a number of other viewers, but they'd prefer to kind of stay out of the limelight. So, which is fine. Not everyone is interested in putting their face on something. But I enjoy having a public discussion about it, and I have no problem talking about it. But in the previous kind of with Troika, we actually we did a whole project on reality, and it was spurred. And in the future, I'll probably, I'll create a video series around this from stories from the Matrix and a couple other things talking about it from kind of my lens and kind of going into some of the actual RV data, but showing maybe some of the actual work. But what comes back when we actually just use, it's what's called a topical search. And a topical search is something that it's when the viewer or the project manager doesn't know the question. They don't know what to ask. And so they might take a symbol or they might take a word, and they don't know necessarily what to ask. So they leave it open-ended. And so the target simply just becomes whatever the word is or whatever the symbol is. And so you might do Mickey Mouse, or you might do another one one that I've actually done is the symbol of dragon. The first, I think it's in Sumerian. There's a symbol for dragon. And so we just put that, it's a top, we don't know what it is. We don't know if it's a word, if it's a type of dance, or if it's something else. Like, you just don't know what question to ask. So you just say, okay, well, what is it? And you do a series of sessions in order, more than one, because there might be a lot of ideas associated with it. And so I did one that was on reality. We took just the word reality, and we hit that as a project over a course of a couple weeks. And kind of in a nutshell, I could talk couple hours actually about what kind of came out of this work. But in a nutshell, what came back from that session work is that reality as we know it, again, it's using our understanding of that word and the meaning and the definition behind it, 3D physical reality, is that what this is not, it's projected. It's not something, it essentially it confirms very much what exists out of ancient culture and their understanding on Maya, on how physical reality isn't real, the idea of dream. And everything that our work described is that reality is something that's illusory. It's something that's actually being generated in someone's mind to believe it's actually real. And then we actually described what's behind that and also the circumstances behind that. So as far as minds existing in large, well, I don't want to spend too much time on it because it kind of one answer begets a million questions, right? But it's Matrix, stories from the Matrix. It's a funny parallel. That movie series actually got that word. The Wachowski brothers. I guess they're not brothers anymore. I suppose the Wachowski twins. Is, I suppose, what they prefer to be called now. But they got the term Matrix from the declassified remote viewing documents. And, this is so fascinating. And they actually named the video there. I think in an old, you can go find an interview of them where they got the name. And it came out of the declassified Stargate documents looking into remote viewing. And so, but... the Matrix is not far off. It's different. It's very, very dramatized, but it's not far off. And as far as the best we can do to understand, the best metaphors we can use, that there are minds that are being linked together in a way to believe that this is real when it's not. And it's being done for a very specific reason. And the big kind of conclusion to it, that all the work came down to and boiled down to, is the why. Why is this being done in this way by this group with us, right? Because I'm in it, you're in it, and we want to know why. And the big reason, it really was very elegant and very simple, is that the big reason was to determine whether you're good or whether you're bad. That's what, apparently, existing outside of this reality, it's not possible to determine that. For some reason, and that this experiment, I'm sure there's a plethora of other reasons, but the underlying purpose that we got back with our remote viewing work, why this exists in this way, is to determine whether you're evil or whether you're good. And that based off of the life you have here, based off the experiences, the circles, again and again and again. I mean, there's way more reasons that, I can spend hours talking about that came out of the work. But the big one, the original one, came because of that. It's to see who you really are. What are you really made of? And that this is essentially a simulation to determine that, so that those outside of it can know. Now, I don't know whether or not you agreed to that or whether or not I agreed to that, but it seems to be the case. At least that's what a remote viewing data came back describing. Sounds like the law of one, harvestable to fourth density, whether it's service to self or service to others. I've read the law of one. It is very similar. The law of one is very interesting. Law is very interesting. I don't want to open that egg, crack that egg right now, because there's a lot there. I've done a lot of remote viewing on law of one. I've done a lot of remote viewing on the Urantia book. And there's a lot there. It's very interesting. It's very fascinating stuff. But service to self, serve to others, positive, negative kind of charge and who you are and the choices you make. It seems to be that this is a mechanism that was designed to determine what your soul is. I say soul loosely because I don't even know if that's the right name for it. But there seems to be a degree also of not really you having the choice in the matter. So you're kind of just thrown into it. So yeah, so we'll see. So, but yeah, that's definitely a lot more on that in probably future webinars and videos, because there's a lot to be said about it. But law of one's interesting. Law of one's very interesting. Let me check. Oh no, yeah. Let me check the chat before we wrap up here. Andrew Cabini asks, what did you find on Antarctica? It's coming in a new Stories from the Matrix. I'll have a whole section on that, because I have so much work talking about Antarctica. We found a lot in Antarctica. We did a lot of work. I have a lot of personal work that I've done on it. Artifacts that are down there, the groups that are down there. It's very busy down there. And very strange, because there's people down there trying to use stuff that they have no idea how it works, and they're causing there's a lot of human experimentation that's going on down there, and with stuff that they don't know how it works. So some of the specifics in that I can go into at a later time on another webinar, another Stories from the Matrix. Hey, Guelmi, nice. I see just checking the chat. Forgot the title to the RV documentary that you showed in class. Oh yeah, RV documentary that I showed. It could be Russell Targ is coming out. I don't think it's out yet. I might have been referring. Guelmi is. I teach remote viewing online and in person. I'm here in Arizona, and so I teach classes either weekend or week-long classes in person, one-on-one. I also teach online as well. I do weekend classes, but Guelmi was a previous student of mine. And I think what you're referring to, Guelmi, is Russell Targ's upcoming documentary, I think. If not, you could always go ahead and email me, and I can let you know. I'll look back through. I mean, there's a lot of different types of stuff, a lot of videos I recommend to look at with remote viewing. But Russell Targ is going around, what is the name called? I'd have to look it up. But if you just look up Russell Targ and documentary, he's going around all the different military guys and kind of doing a last hurrah. I mean, they're all getting pretty up there in the years. So it's actually really, I'm happy he's kind of doing that, kind of just to have a little bit of history left from the original group that developed the skill and during the Cold War and all their stories. So look up Russell Targ documentary. You'll probably find it. All right, I think that is all the questions that I have here on the Q&A and the chat. Wow, 9:50. We certainly went longer than I thought. This is fun though. I enjoy doing this. So I thank you guys for joining me for this. This is the first one. It's kind of an experiment to see how it worked, and wanted to keep it kind of like a small. Had limited kind of openings to those that can kind of join. So thanks for joining me on this experiment. If you guys have any feedback for me, please don't feel free to email me. I'll switch that over. Just the email for this, or let's actually do this and go to that. Come back for the next one. We'll talk about this right here, which if you want to email me, there's my email address. It's just directors@technicalintuition.com. Technicalintuition.com is the new website that I'm using. I have a lot of stuff coming up. I'm not really promoting much right now, other than if you're interested in instruction or work. I do optimum trajectory work for people. Check out the website. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I do online instruction as well. 1 and 2 day courses online. So if you're interested in remote viewing, send me an email. I'm happy to talk about it. But other than that, thank you guys so much for coming. It's been a pleasure talking with you guys, and kind of talking about the stuff that I'm really, it's just fun for me. Like this, I'm really passionate about remote viewing. I'm passionate about sharing it. And I hope to do more of these in the future, and also kind of set up a regular schedule for YouTube videos as well. And we'll just see how this evolves and grows. And then, we'll see what happens. So thank you, everyone. I'll have a recording of this as well up on my YouTube channel, Technical Intuition YouTube channel. It'll be sent out to you, I'm sure, once it gets posted, if you signed up. And I think that's it. So have a good evening. Thanks for staying with me. And until next time, cheers.